When we are in the middle of life, it's messy. A million things are happening at once. We don't know how anything will turn out. In hindsight, of course, we build simple narratives that explain it all. The past is always one linear story. And so, when we think of our freedom struggle, we think of Indian freedom fighters coming together to fight the British. But really, there was much more than that going on. They were also fighting each other, trying to reconcile their thoughts with those of their fellows, fighting in the marketplace of ideas, fighting in the marketplace of politics, fighting for themselves as much as for this nation state, which didn't then exist, which had to be imagined into being. In their quest to define themselves, these men and women also shaped what we are today. If you want to understand where we are, you need to know where we came from.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Shruti Kapila, a professor at Cambridge who's just come out with a book named Violent Fraternity, Indian Political Thought in the Global Age. This book examines political thought in India in the first half of the 20th century and looks at major figures like Tilak, Gandhi, Ambedkar, Savarkar, Iqbal and Patel to see how they clashed in terms of ideas and actions. One of Shruti's main points also is that Indian political thought evolved in unique ways that have no relation to how political thought developed elsewhere. So we can't apply foreign prisms to understand India. And it's important to get a sense of those debates and those maneuverings because they still matter today. At one point, Shruti writes about how Hindutva is, quote, a theory of violence in search of its own history, stop quote. Think about that again. A theory of violence in search of its own history. That is so resonant and so thought provoking, just like Shruti's book and many of her insights in this conversation itself. But before we begin the conversation, let's take a quick commercial break. Long before I was a podcaster, I was a writer. In fact, chances are that many of you first heard of me because of my blog India Uncut, which was active between 2003 and 2009 and became somewhat popular at the time. I loved the freedom the form gave me, and I feel I was shaped by it in many ways. I exercised my writing muscle every day and was forced to think about many different things because I wrote about many different things. Well, that phase in my life ended for various reasons, and now it is time to revive it. Only now I'm doing it through a newsletter. I have started the India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com, where I will write regularly about whatever catches my fancy. I'll write about some of the themes I cover in this podcast and about much else. So please do head on over to indiauncut.substack.com and subscribe. It is free. Once you sign up, each new installment that I write will land up in your email inbox. You don't need to go anywhere. So subscribe now for free. The India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com. Thank you. Shruti, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
You know, while reading up on you, I realized that you grew up in Chandigarh just like me. In fact, you did your... I did. I was born and brought up there. I was kind of there till the 8th standard. So there were possibly a few years in the early 80s when I imagine we were in the same city at the same time.
Oh, wow. Yes. Well, I was definitely there in the early 80s.
Yeah. I mean, I was born at the end of 73 and then I left in, I think, 86. So that's my kind of span of time there.
Right. I never left it till I was 21. So my first 2 decades, I mean, I did my entire schooling and even my undergraduate degree there. So yeah, I mean, this cannot go on the program, but which sector did you grow up in?
I was actually going to ask you on the record itself.
You can ask. You can ask. Okay.
No, we can just continue like this. Yeah. I was in Sector 16 to begin with. I mean,
Right.
I was probably born in some other sector, but the key years of the childhood which you remember were in Sector 16. What about you?
Oh, well, we were neighbors. I was in Sector 11 most of my life there. And so we were just across, as it were, and we had very good family friends in Sector 16. And so Chandigarh is small. At least then it was pretty small. And did you study in St. John's or where did you study?
I studied in St. John's, my God.
So I studied next door in Sacred Heart.
What a small
So
world, yeah.
we probably like I used to cycle to school
So you
quite a
must have
lot,
passed
and
each other.
exactly, or you must be one of those boys who made our lives miserable trying to leave the so
No, no,
yeah.
I was a very good boy, but I can totally imagine you cycling past and me thinking, "Hey, that girl looks like she's really smart." So, as it kind of
Thank
turned
you.
out, yeah.
That's very very sweet of you. And then after that, where did you go?
After that, I went all over the place. My dad was an IS officer, so he was posted to
Oh,
Pune
okay,
between 86 and 91.
right,
And I finished my education in Pune in 94, and then I've been in
right.
Bombay since 95. Though my dad retired in Chandigarh in Sector 11,
Oh,
where
does he live in sector? So they you still
no,
go to Chandigarh?
he passed away last
Oh,
year.
I'm
But
so
I used
sorry.
to go
I'm
all
so
the
sorry.
time to Sector 11 and meet him there. And it's one of the interesting things about Chandigarh is how other cities have kind of changed. Other cities where I
Hmm,
have been to
hmm,
once in a
hmm,
while,
hmm,
but
hmm,
I don't know if it's because of the wide, expansive spaces and the fact
hmm,
that you
hmm,
can't
hmm,
really
hmm.
in terms of space there are those limitations. There is what there is. Maybe that's one reason, but
No, I
it's
think
still.
that's right. Yeah, that's right. It's very the Corbusier master plan, which kind of became something that the administration had to stick to, is both a good thing and a bad thing in some ways. But the city has really expanded, in all the other directions now. So you have also New Chandigarh now, and you have, Naya Gaon and all these other places which, are now, and the tech city, and so it's more sprawling, but you're right. The old bits and certain. It has a kind of architectural integrity which very few cities in India have, and so they look like mishmashes, like even Delhi is a mishmash of different architectural styles. Chandigarh that way is quite coherent.
Yeah, I mean, it leads to a dilemma for me because when it comes to urban planning, I'm kind of a follower of Jane Jacobs, and I think cities
Hmm,
should evolve organically and all of that.
hmm,
So
hmm,
just
hmm.
ideologically, I'm kind of against the kind of central planning that went into Chandigarh. But when I go there, I just love it. You know, so what do you do?
I know,
So
but I see
yeah.
what you mean, because I used to feel very bad, like when I started traveling, especially in India. So, of course, my mother's family is from, like, the Punjab. You have places you go to, whether in Punjab or older cities, or elsewhere, even in Himachal, where our families were spread. So, the thing was that I used to feel very strange that this was a city that had no kind of concession to the past. It had no kind of, memory even etched in of the past, and this was particularly so when I went to Banaras for the first time. It was like a complete opposite. But then, actually, as I thought about it, since we are talking about books and ideas and stuff, and Chandigarh is a very interesting place to grow in, and it's a truly Nehruvian city in that sense, and because I realized that now that we're talking about the central vista in India, like where, the imperial past is being redone and stuff, I was really, in time, I think that Nehru's vision was quite bold, because though he was a historian, if you look at the city makes no concession to the past. It makes no concession even to the vernacular. None of these things are there. Okay, people can have ideological views on it, but as a city which is a post partition city, it is made as a kind of signature for a post partition India from the very province where, as it were, Pakistan is settled in effect, because of East and West Pakistan, East and West Punjab, rather. And then you think, wow, this is really futuristic. This is really bold. It's really, it wants to occupy the future rather than occupy the past. And so it's kind of I've enjoyed, I mean, when I was growing up there, certainly I found undergraduate years very stifling. And that was because of militancy. And that's partly why, after, this is not, my first project, this is this book, in a way, if you had lived on in Chandigarh, say through the late 80s and certainly the early 90s, that very decade of militancy, it really, it also changed the culture of the city, because when I was slightly younger, when I was a child, there was a lot more public culture. And then, yeah, it became, and today the city is very, it's vibrant, but its texture is much more commercial. It's less of a bureaucratic city, less of a city of bureaucrats, less of a kind of cultural hub of ideas or books, because it was a center of both Punjabi, Urdu, but also English literature and, of course, journalism. Because my father was a journalist, it's there. All of those things are there, but now the dominant side of it is commerce. It's very commercial in both good and bad. It's an underrated city in India.
Yeah, and obviously what we feel about it will be tied up with memories and also is complicated. It's interesting. You should talk about, Nehru not giving any concession to the past, because, in the case of Chandigarh, it's okay. You're kind of building up a city where there's nothing there. You're not imposing a vision on something that exists. It's just barren land and then you build the city and all of that. And that's an interesting experiment. But in general, I recently did an episode with Ripur Daman Singh and Adil Hussain, both, I think, students of yours, in their excellent book, and they have that debate in their book between Nehru and Iqbal and also Nehru and Jinnah. And you get the sense in parts of it that Nehru, as he was moving towards this whole project of constructing an idea of India, was sometimes perhaps guilty of not taking into account what was already there. And you see this in the sense that Iqbal tries to school him on what Indian Islam really is like. And you also see this when, Nehru tells Jinnah that the communal thing is an elite problem. It is not, all of that.
I wouldn't go that far. But Adil is a former student of mine, a graduate student of mine. Tripur Daman was part of the set. I only taught him a course. I can't claim any credit for him. But, the thing is that I didn't mean it in the sense of him being uncaring of the past. When I said that Nehru gave no concession to the past. So if you look at his very famous speech, The Tryst with Destiny, that speech also says, we only hear one bit. We know that phrase, India's tryst with destiny and the rest. But actually, the speech, if you read the following sentences, is very interesting, because he says, well, India's had a sad past, but the past is over. So he refers to the British as a sad past. And he's saying what we are going to occupy is the future. And it's a future that others will write about. So it's an interesting, I think it's a kind of unprecedented and unparalleled post-colonial confidence in a way that allows him also, I'm sitting in England and I've been in India for, several, for the past 2-3 years, primarily in India, though, of course, living between the two places. And I'm struck by the debates on empire decolonization, which are taking place here. So I've had just a debate in my faculty on empire over naming. It's a naming of a building. It's, should it be called after a particular historian, et cetera, et cetera. Now, and the students who have requested or petitioned or mobilized to change the name, it's kind of an open question at the moment, they they deploy the language of decolonization. They deploy the language of primarily decolonization and race and racial equity. And I'm struck by what happened in India. So in the sense that we are all children of post-colonialism. We are, you and I are of the same generation, and so we might not be Nehru's children. We're not the generation of 47. But the thing is that it's interesting that Nehru is able to manage a very, not painless, but a very psychologically sophisticated transition from empire to nationalism. Because you don't see the desire, like the British hold no real existential value for Indians. Yeah. They have gone, okay, go. We won this moral and political fight. And, but there is none of this kind of, the British no longer occupy the mindsets of Indians, right? Either in hatred or in denigration or as attachment. They're gone. They're simply gone. And in that sense, the way he naturalized the Lutyens landscape, the central vista, he made it Indian. There was no, you can't, when I at least have, whizzed past those buildings or even been through them, I think of them as quintessentially Indian buildings, right? They look, they look British, in terms of, the style, but but they feel very part of Indian fabric, and so I found that very mature, that you got rid of the empire, you Indianized the stuff, you occupied the future in a way that the British then lost their salience, their importance, their full importance in India. So, which is not to say that we need to love Churchill. No one, I mean, every Indian knows that Churchill was very bad to India, but no one is going to have an agitation around him. Whereas, that's the stuff of politics here. But if you look at the Central Vista project, and I don't want to get into too much controversial ground straight up, but if you look at the Central Vista project, the project, and certainly some of the figures, even historians like, say, Vikram Sampath, who have written on Savarkar, they deploy the language of decolonization. And, they say, well, this is, we are decolonizing Indian history. And you think, really? I mean, for one, so you get the kind of flipping. Here it's the left using the language of decolonization, and there you have, as it were, center-right and right-wing historians using the language of decolonization. And I think I'm closer to Nehru and other figures. They never use this word. They never use the word decolonization, because after all, they were becoming free. They were taking charge of their own histories and their futures. So in a way, the empire just lost its value in every sense. So I find it's kind of slightly perverse return in debates around the Central Vista and Savarkar. Not disconcerting, but it speaks back to the Nehruvian movement.
In your book, you've quoted Carl Schmitt in various places, and one of Schmitt's fundamental things, of course, is that in politics you need an other. And just thinking aloud, I would imagine that if you want to place the Central Vista project within a narrative, your chosen other right now is, of course, a Muslim. That's what modern politics is all about, the hatred of the Muslim. That's what we see over here. But you can't bring the Muslim into a narrative for the Central Vista project. So obviously you'll go back to decolonization, because there is no other enemy. Right? So I guess...
Yeah, but I actually think this hidden enemy is Nehru. Because, the hidden enemy, the undeclared enemy is Nehru. Because it's not just Hindu-Muslim, it's the remaking of a new India as the word goes on. We're tired of hearing what new India, we don't know what new India is, but we hear it all the time. But what is it? It's actually in opposition to the compact, the political settlement of India of 1947 to 50. And so secularism, part of, the fact that, post-imperialism was just made sense of very quickly. We can come to Schmitt, but I think the problem, is a good one that you pose. Who really is the political enemy in India? And that really is a foundational question of the book. And Schmitt is important only because, he's a very controversial figure. He was a jurist of the Nazis. But the reason why particularly historians, or not historians, but theorists from the left have used Schmitt is, say, Badiou, or even, Derrida earlier, actually. So lots of Zizek, they've all, they've taken on Schmitt, but obviously you can't accuse them of being, pro-Nazi or anything. But the reason they use him is because, and that's also my reason, is that Schmitt offers the most precise critique of liberalism. That, you can't just say, there is no squeamishness. You shouldn't, he doesn't run away from the difficult questions, or doesn't try and put a kind of curtain, or doesn't try and make them, doesn't sugarcoat the issue, and that's why Schmitt is important. And that's why it allows us to, at least it allowed me to think in the book that, look, in 1857, Indians killed the British in large numbers. They killed women, they killed children, they killed, of course, men. We've all seen Janoon. If we haven't, people should see it. It's, you see the way in which it's a kind of, and it's the largest violence the British will see in the 19th century outside of the Crimean War. It takes the British 2 years to suppress the mutiny. It leads to the modernization of its army. It's a profound moment for, British institutions as well. But 90 years later, the British are singularly spared. So what happens? When you have the moment of freedom, of course, if you look at British accounts, of the mid 40s to 47, they're quite paranoid. They feel that, that violence that is in the society will come to them, and of course there is kind of also a kind of hasty retreat. There is a retreat. People just up and leave, whether they are army men or civilians or business figures and what have you. They decamp very quickly. But the question is not that, because their fears were misplaced, because the Indians were really not interested. The British were no longer the enemy, as it were, and that's really the book's work. That, why is it that political enmity turned on the Hindu-Muslim question? More than the Hindu-Muslim question, why did it turn intimate? So if you look at the story of the West, its passage to modernity, its passage to modern statecraft is rested on two principles. One, the complete monopoly of violence by the state, that the state will be the author of violence, its protector, its legitimate user. So it has control over violence. And the second is that the figure of the political enemy will always be the foreigner. So the foreigner and the external always are kind of theorized, and also not just theorized, but weaponized as the enemy. So it could be the refugee, the immigrant today, but the European problem of the Jewish question, though the Jews were internal to European history, they were seen to be external and the like, right? I mean, there's a kind of the Jewish question becomes one of foreignness. And in India, that's really interesting. In India, it departs, that's the central claim of the book, is that it departs from Western political ideas, even as it remakes them in a big way, is, the enemy will not be the external. I mean, the British have no existential political value to Indians, and right from 1905-08, when the book opens. And that's not because, they're not powerful. Of course, they're incredibly powerful in 1905-08, but they have lost their salience as their status, their existential status as the political opponent. And that's really what the book is about, that in a way, this is truly a post-colonial project, because India's founding figures have already thought of a political future where the British don't exist, and that's, and they're really interested in how to live with each other. And also, then the question of enmity is, going to the Gita, really the intimate kin, that's why the Gita becomes big. So, but it's interesting because Schmidt allows you, since you mentioned Schmidt, he's that's really his value. His value really is the way he can identify a problem that liberals are too either scared or too hypocritical to name.
The way I see it, an insight is an insight. So, whatever the history of the thinker otherwise might be, or whatever he might be, connected with, in his case, his Nazi history, it doesn't really matter. It's a powerful insight, which I keep coming back to, even when I look at modern India, and even, in fact, the splinterings within the BJP and within the right, where now that they've kind of obliterated the other, they are sort of turning on each other.
You turn on each other. But that's happened to the left too. So the left also had this problem that since it's failed in curtailing the power of the right, they have turned on each other. They police what is the right thing to say, so there's a kind, it's a different kind of policing going on there. It's more of a policing of words and actions and culture. Whereas in the big BJP family, we are seeing that it's become internecine, with now with the various factions and so on. But I think the central insight of the period, of the early period, which is foundational to, as it were, even the grammar we are in, is really that as the Gita. Why does the Gita become such a big political text in the 20th century? Today I was listening to Radio 4. They had a kind of morning show on the Arthashastra of all things. And it's really interesting that Arthashastra is really not referred to much. A, it's translated very late. B, hardly anyone cares about it, Unlike, say, the Gita, which becomes the text for Indian political actors to imagine, to think through their problems. And I was interested in that question. Why the Gita? And and there the answer is a very simple. Then I elaborate it with Tilak. It's a question because it forces you to ask who the enemy is, and the answer is obviously the only the brother, the intimate, the neighbor, the kin is open to enmity. The foreigner is of no value in that story. But then the second order, the big question, is it okay to kill your own? And the third question then, that violence, which is really the main kind of driver of the book, that violence is not a question to be handled only by the state. In fact, far from it. So, the Indian political leaders had a very particular problem. So the book opens with 1905-08, which is considered to be the first mass moment of Indian politics, which is the Swadeshi era politics. And I don't know how many of your listeners will know this, but this was about the proposed partition of Bengal in bikers, and of course there's a pushback and by all sorts of regional leaders, particularly in Maharashtra, but now today Maharashtra, but also Bengal, obviously Bengal because it concerned Bengal, and also Punjab. So you had Lajpat Rai, you had, Aurobindo Ghosh, but above all you had Tilak. And they fail. The partition is kind of withdrawn, but the movement fails because everyone is put into prison, there's mass repression, and, Tilak is sent into prison, solitary confinement in Rangoon. And he is, the figurehead. He's the most famous kind of leader at this point prior to Gandhi. So he's not a minor figure. And he's just wondering, what happened? He realized that actually the British imperial state had become all too powerful. It had reached a kind of different stage of its maturity where it was entirely peaceful and could co-opt Indians, as you know, English education and whatnot. This degree of kind of progress in India, often, and so it could be permanent at this rate. And so the idea would be that you'll have to change, not just, so the idea is, how do you now forge a politics which can succeed? And the answer is Tilak decouples the question of law and violence, or the state and violence. And this is profound because, the history of the modern state is that it's the state which is the legitimate owner and prosecutor of violence. That's why you have armies. That's why you have armies on the borders. And what Tilak says, following on from the Gita, that actually life and death are questions of you and I have life and death. These are individual attributes. These are not attributes belonging to the state that it can deploy, control, manage, and the like. And as a result, violence also inheres in you and me. It is not something which is, out there. Of course, it could be abstracted. So he breaks away with this abstraction of law with violence. And this produces a very operable political subject. And the Gita, and then he says openly, all political questions are Kshatriya questions, which is to say, it's not a caste. Obviously, it has a caste slur, but at a more foundational level, he means that war, the theme of war and warriorness defines the political. The political is not about, you and me negotiating, which is what the British and liberal imperials were doing. You petition the state and say, my people need some more rights, and, how come we are not sitting on juries and, whatnot. And he says, well, this is just nonsense, because this is going. So this breaks apart the liberal imperial story completely. And from then on, you will see, even Gandhi belongs in this tradition. When Gandhi is also of the same tradition that life and death they're not state questions. They are questions that belong to individuals. But of course, Gandhi will have a completely different outcome to the same starting point. And it's a story that stays in India till date. But, we can unpack it slowly, because you can even think about today's farmers' movement, as a Gandhian moment as well.
Fabulous. So, I was actually going to go back to your childhood and talk about growing up in
Let's
Chandigarh
do
and how
that.
you got,
Let's do
but
that.
no, but we'll do that after this because you've already, gotten us to this sort of fascinating point. So we'll just take this to the break
Up to
and then we'll
you.
go
You
back to your
know how to do.
childhood.
You know how to do
Yeah.
this.
Well, so here's a question that arises from this. Like reading your extremely fascinating chapter on Tilak, your first chapter, Political Theology of Sedition. At one point, you spoke about bomb throwing. Like you spoke about how the scholar Christopher Penny compared bomb technology with that of the printing press. And Tilak spoke about how it was pregnant with democratic possibilities and so on and so forth. And I began to kind of think aloud and tell me if this makes any sense to you. One of the sort of processes that I have been examining in my last few episodes, so they have nothing to do with the subject of your book or what you study, is how technology is leading to all kinds of decentralization and a crumbling away of the mainstream, right? So you see this in the media where in the 90s you have your mainstream newspapers, you have a consensus on the truth, and that gets completely decentralized because of technology. And I would argue the net effect is good, but there are a lot of problems such as you no longer have a consensus on the truth. There are just, narrative battles everywhere, so on and so forth. You see a similar thing in music, for example, where there is no longer a mainstream. Once upon a time, maybe rock could have been called mainstream, but now it's not the case. Now it's kind of splintered. And I would say on the whole, that's a great thing because much more expression of individuality and scope for people to find whatever they want. And and even nation states, perhaps in the modern time, where nation states are getting less and less control over their citizens or over their subjects, as the case often is in practice, because individuals are being empowered with different kinds of technology. You can't stop them from being globalized, and you can't stop the flow of ideas and all. So just thinking about bombs and Tilak, it struck me that bombs in a sense are also a form of decentralization, because what you're talking about, the monopoly of power being with the state, suddenly now this technology, bombs, has decentralized that a little bit, that
Oh, yeah,
individuals
hugely. Okay, so let's talk about him. Let's talk about Bomb and let's talk about Tilak, but also talk about that terrible word sedition. And then we can talk about technology and state. And these are fascinating questions, and I'm totally interested in them because. So let me stick with history for a minute. And so we of course know sedition is back in our times. It never actually really went away, but it's back in a big way in our times. But his is the most famous sedition case in Indian history, and it's the case is refers to actually bomb throwing, and that comes, so you have, again, it's interesting to talk because it's we've just been living through a pandemic. So you had the Bombay plague in 1897, which is incredibly it had very draconian, since you're in Bombay, it was the epicenter, and that's where a lot of the repressive technologies, state technologies came through. You should see some images, of that period. You have like what are now trolls, but that time they were like, all these small, the sort of the housing, the Indian housing, especially around working districts. You had these like these fire hoses just coming and just dropping really kind of powerful, what would be now pesticides, some sort of medicinal, to decontamination. And it was a kind of, it's quite aggressive to have your house being doused while you're sitting in it, and people were also being taken out and put into camps and the like. So there was a very kind of, that kind of triggers in some ways Tilak's politics. And you have, as it were, the assassination of the plague commissioner in Pune, and him and his lieutenant, they're just, killed off. And initially the government is unable to pin, the law is not sufficient at that point to say, well, murderous acts, because the inspiration was Tilak. They could not find a direct relationship, but they could say that what Tilak had written in his papers was contributing to it. But the thing that really ups the ante is that you have in distant Bengal, Khudiram Bose, that very famous legend. Khudiram Bose also wanted to kill a British official, but his bomb ends up killing two women by mistake, and two British women, but, and it got called the Muzaffarpur outrage. And then it occasions Tilak's writings on the bomb. And this is what becomes the centerpiece of his sedition trial. And there he says, well, the bomb, he says, is a secret amulet. He says, it's like a charm. It's like, it has a magic. It has jadoo, because it converts things. It converts a relationship. So that's its secret. Its magic is its ability to alter. But secondly, it is so easy to assemble. It is truly democratic because it's very easy to assemble. And above all, it puts the king and subject in the same position of power. There is a kind of, that's the democratization. The democratization is that you circumvent the state. You're the king. You have all the armies. You have brought all these draconian laws. You have brought all these, the tyranny of, surveillance and the like that he is kind of really inveighing against. What are people to do? And his answer is that the bomb has offered a kind of sublime, is the word, sublime possibilities. And this is where his critique of imperial power and sovereignty would start. He would say, well, it is, the bomb is not just he says, I'm not sort of saying yes or no to Khudiram, but the bomb has allowed the king and the most oppressed subject to be part of the same dialogue. It can't be, it can't again be abstracted and put away in a third place. But he makes another case which actually really, so the British get really upset. The Rowlett report would also later say the same. They think that this is just part of a kind of global anarchist pattern, because you see even in this period, Tsarist Russia, I don't know how many people have seen any series around the early 20th century, lots of Netflix series on Russia at the moment. And, there's a lot of bomb throwing in Tsarist Russia. And this is, 1905-08. And even in Portugal, even in, so there's a kind of wave of, anarchism, that young men are using bombs to kind of overthrow the thing. But Tilak is saying, well, our use of the bomb, Indian use of the bomb is not the European use of the bomb, because they are interested in class conflict. They're interested in, getting rid of kings and, moneylenders. Ours is about the British. It's a political, so that's why he uses the word, it's democratic. And it's true that this is this would influence his followers, Tilak's followers, for one, Savarkar, but also the Gadar people who would then go throw bombs across the world in it. So I think your broader question of technology and centralization is a really important one, because I don't see it so much in terms of centralization. I see it in terms of what is democratization, where is democratization going on. And there I would somewhat be a bit more cautious than you, in the sense that I think contemporary wars on data, data, the new oil, you must have heard it many times by now in your podcast. The thing is that it appears as decentralized to us. It feels like, okay, I'm sitting in Cambridge, you're sitting in Bombay. We are having a great chat. We are having a chat about the same people and its technology, and we thank that, world. But at the same time, I really am interested in democracy and democratization. I do think some of these technologies are eroding democracy. So they might free up the citizen or individual or whoever. But I think whether it has been Cambridge Analytica and, whatever we know about Brexit or the Trump election, and indeed the use of social media in Indian elections, we can't just say it's just competitive narratives. It's just very expensive for business of this, But I think, I think it gives us choice. But I'm not sure if it makes us more free.
But no, great points. And the future is unknown, so one never knows. I don't do this anymore, and I'll tell you why. But whenever I would end my episodes, I'd ask my guests about what makes them despair and what makes them hopeful. And the reason I don't ask this anymore is because there isn't much people have to say anymore in the hopeful part of the sort of equation. So these days I end my episodes, as I will eventually end this one, by asking
Thanks
my
for the
guests to
warning.
kind of no, these days I end my episodes by asking my guests to recommend books they love and so on and so forth, because they don't have
Ah,
to search for something that gives them hope. So
yeah.
the sort of very interesting framing that I found in your book about political thinkers of that time, which I hadn't really considered that way before, is all of us look back to the freedom struggle in those years as being a battle of Indians against the British, right? That's a typical kind of framing. And your framing is kind of different, and you introduce it right at the start by something that is known in psychology as the hedgehog's dilemma. And I'll quickly read it out and then ask you to sort of elaborate, where you speak about this fable, which goes like this. Quote, a family of hedgehogs massed very close together one winter's day, hoping to use one another's warmth to protect themselves against the cold. However, they soon felt one another's prickles, which made them draw apart. When the need for warmth brought them closer together once again, this second evil was repeated, with the result that they were bounced back and forth between the two ills until they established a moderate degree of distance from one another in which they could best endure their condition. Stop quote. And this is Freud quoting Schopenhauer. And your central point, which I wanted to elaborate on, is that the focus of these years following 1905, 1908, the resistance to the partition of Bengal essentially faces defeat. Figures like Tagore and Aurobindo withdraw from the active fight, and Tilak is left doing whatever he does. Gandhi eventually appears on the scene, and so on and so forth. And your central thesis is that here, what we have ignored and what your book tries to bring to the forefront is this battle between this fraternity of brothers, this bunch of hedgehogs drawing closer together and then bouncing further apart because, hey, prickly and all of that. And this is really fascinating. And your point is that the British is no longer such the focus of what's going on. They're also focusing on each other, and there's stuff happening there. So elaborate on this a little bit, because I found this so fascinating, counterintuitive, and I hadn't heard this aspect before.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's not, to be sure, it's not that the British don't, they are there. I mean, what I find fascinating about this moment is precisely this deep intellectual and political confidence to not just rewrite modern politics, but to start thinking of a politics in which the British don't exist. So, this is at the moment of the height of powers of the British. This is post Curzon, all this is a kind of completely new kind of phase of British imperialism in India. And it could be, as I said, could have been permanent. And this is what they're reckoning with, that, this could just be permanent. And yet, in that moment, it's not despair and helplessness, but a way in which a kind of existential move is made to start thinking, to occupy, as I say, the future. They don't want to occupy the past and worry just also about the present. And the turn is to the inner, to the internal. And there are two ways you could understand it. One way is, if I can be a bit more about political thought, one way would be that, of course, modern politics is made on that very famous French revolutionary triad of liberty, equality, and fraternity is the last one. And you could say that the failure of the Swadeshi is also the end of liberalism in India, whether it's Indianized form, particularly its Indianized form, because the concern with ideas of freedom will give way to how to live with each other. So liberty would be jettisoned as a primary concern, which is not to say that the struggle for independence will not mean much, but the central question would be how to be with each other. And as a result, the British lose, as I say, the existential validity in India. It's a truly post-colonial moment in that sense, 50 years prior to independence, 40 years prior to independence, because they are thinking, they're not going to be here. That's going to happen. But what about it if they're not here? And so the turn is, so in a way, it degrades the empire at the very height of its power, that it denies its status as a political enemy. They're just there. They're rulers. They will go. The eventual victory is assumed by these figures. But by the same token, the thing then therefore that matters, and that's my insight from Freud, because I'm very interested in psychoanalysis, that it's only love objects who can become objects of hatred. So our enmity, the interesting thing about the Hindu Muslim question is it's an intimate one, like the hedgehogs, drawing in, drawing apart, coming in, coming out. But it is the question of intimate enmity in that sense is important, because only love can convert to hatred and hatred to love. The British have become an indifferent presence. The fight, of course, the kind of institutional fight will be with them. But there's a kind of complete indifference to the British. They have been degraded. They don't exist. Everyone knows if they have a fight with someone very close, the way best thing to do is to ghost them, But if you're constantly fighting with them, you're giving them a kind of presence, right? I mean, even if it is a negative. So it's a two-way move. It's a deeply confident post-colonial moment to think of life without the British, even at the height of the power of British in that moment. And secondly, that it also correctly identifies the British as truly foreign and in India, without actually those strings of attachment of love and hate, which we give to our intimates. So they're truly not the intimates in India, in Indian history. And as a result, the story turns to Hindu-Muslim questions and also subsequently caste questions, because those are intimate questions of how to be with one another. But finally, you would say that, not to get too technical, but liberty would be degraded in favor of what political thought people, or what is generally known as sovereignty, how to control your own destiny. So not so much about freedom, but how to kind of take charge of questions of life, death, national destiny, and the like, what we call sovereignty and sovereign status of Indians. Yeah, so I think that's really, the way I see it, both as a way of what Freud would call identification. Indians stop identifying with the British, let's simply put. They've gone, they've left, and even though Nehru would, I think, he gets misquoted, but I think, or misunderstood rather. I feel rather sad for him these days. That he was the last Englishman to rule over India. He's very famous, but he's being ironic. He's basically being ironic because he himself had this. If you read him, he just has a small walk-on part in my book. He's not there. I don't devote a chapter to him, but it's just interesting that if you read his autobiography, he's very influenced by Freud. He's reading psychoanalysis, in his prison and stuff. And he just says, Gandhi really represents India. He really is the soul of India. He's always feeling that somehow, he's not Indian enough. He's always battling with this, problem. But but he was a true Indian in some ways, because in lots of ways. So, yeah, I think to turn to that, it's about intimacy. It's about things. Why the Hindu-Muslim question matters is because, it's a love, hate, love. It can move one way to another. Whereas the British are just, either powerful foreigners. That's it. So once you disempower them, they're just foreigners.
Yeah, in that phrase, which he obviously meant in a tongue-in-cheek way, last Englishman to rule over India, I think I wouldn't have a problem with the Englishman bit. I'd have a problem with the rule over India bit, that word rule. But,
why?
So because our governments are supposed to serve us, not rule us. I think it's that mentality which is the problem. Right. No, but that's a pet peeve of mine, that we are subjects, not citizens. That's what we made ourselves. My next question is going to seem a little naive for sure. So, forgive me in advance for that. And because I don't know anything about psychoanalysis, but I am sort of fascinated by what you said about the relationship between love and hate, where we tend to hate that which we love the most. And I am just thinking of that in concrete terms, and I'm thinking of modern India, and I'm saying, no, most of these Hindutva people, their hate for Muslims doesn't come from any love for them. There are, of course, many people like me who are born Hindu and who love many things about Islam, from the food to the culture and all of that. But when you actually see the violence being committed everywhere against Muslims and the people who are part of these political movements, I don't think there's any love there. I think there is just genuine resentment and hate. And
I see what you're saying.
am I being too simplistic by
Oh,
interpreting
no.
it in a literal way?
Oh, no. I think that's absolutely correct. But it's the hatred comes. So it's not whether that love may have existed or not existed. My point is that even hatred is sign of intimacy. Is my point, and the problem for Hindutva, and this is my Savarkar chapter, and also it stays till date. It remains relevant till date. The problem for Hindutva is twofold. One, that India doesn't offer Hindus a pure monopoly of the past or of the future, which is not just in terms of Muslim rule, which I think, we'll come to in a second, but actually for Savarkar, the biggest problem is that of Buddhism. That one, India is births not one but two religions, two great world religions. Buddhism's born in India. It's a crucible of India's a crucible of Hinduism. Of course, it's then shunted out in the second century and onwards. And but the thing is, so the problem is of one of attachment, like who fully attaches and who is fully owns India. And for the Hindutva lot, it's a problem because India is not only the kind of wellspring in terms of that, but then you also have this kind of idea of Muslim rulership, where you've had Muslim empires in India, and this kind of causes, and yet and this is something that actually the person who writes most insightfully about it is actually Ambedkar. So Ambedkar is saying, look, he writes in the 30s, 40s, and it's quoted in my book. It's about the partition question. Ambedkar is saying, look, Hindus and Muslims are actually quite tied together. Caste Hindus and Muslims, they are symbolically tied together. They share a lot together. They're honeycombed. He uses the word, they're honeycombed, and it's true whether these are ritual practices, Sufi, Panths, whatever, there's a whole life of kind of popular religiosity and devotionalism, which speaks to that mixture, which I don't need to go into here. But he's also not talking just about devotionalism and religiosity. He's actually talking about a shared history of rulership, that Hindus have been rulers and Muslims have been rulers. The reason he says they are fighting in the 20th century with each other is because the nation state is a competitive arena of identities. And that's all he's saying. So he's not saying that they are like, he's not making the British imperial argument, ki bhai, Hindus and Muslims are primordially or, inherently ill-disposed to each other, that they are antagonistic. He's saying, no, actually, they are so tied together culturally and symbolically. And they are now fighting because this is a competitive arena. And this is why he will end up arguing for partition, because partition allows for some kind of cooling off between these and separating of these kind of hostilities. Right? So today's Hindutva, the figure of the Muslim is weaponized and is seen. And why is that? You should ask why, I know. There is no, the Hindu majority is so large, where does this fear come from? Where does this kind of antagonism come from? And I think the antagonism does come, as I say, there's also these questions of conversion and reconversion that, they are part of Hindus and Muslims are all part of and it's complicated in the way that Nehru complicates it, that Muslim empires, he says, Nehru in Discovery of India is brilliant when he says that it's only the British who are exceptional to Indian history. There have been empires all through India's history, all kinds of people have come and ruled over it. But it's the British alone who are not loyal to its own people, And so even the Mughals, Mongol, so-called Mongol empires, even the Persianate influence, the Indo-Islamic, the Indo-Persianate world, these people all marry, not just marry in, they are loyal to the people they are ruling. So there's a kind of deep intimacy to the Hindu-Muslim question, not just of rulership and devotionalism, which for the Hindutva lot is a problem because India's history is a history of mixture and miscegenation. So, it's not like the passage to Nazism or fascism. I was asked this question today also, at the JLF thing, because, the thing is that if you look at modern states in Europe, they have always claimed a kind of purity of language, race, but certainly religion. You don't have to be too hard pressed to say whether European states have the domination of certain religion. Though they might say they're secular. Now, India doesn't have that luxury, or even I think India's more interesting precisely because it has to kind of think about its modern statecraft out of sheer diversity. And the problem for Hindutva is that it doesn't believe, it wants a kind of not homogeneity simply. It wants the rule of a political Hindu-ness. It doesn't want Hinduism. It wants a political Hindu-ness to emerge. And the way it sees it can emerge, and which is why for Savarkar, war is so important, that it can only be made through bloodshed. It cannot be the purity of, there's no pure race to return to, or to kind of, in fact, the way Hindu-ness will be. So basically, Hindutva becomes a fight with India's past. It's a war with India's past above all, which it wants to overcome. It wants to overcome the history of miscegenation and mixture. And therefore, to me, it's a theory of violence, really, which uses history as a way of, it deploys history as a way of thinking about that problem. So the Hindu-Muslim question is complicated for me to summarize. I mean, it's complicated even in Savarkar by Buddhism, and for Ambedkar by the caste question. So the Hindu-Muslim question can never be a binary, though people will want to make it that way. But even if you look at the Uttar Pradesh elections going on now, it's a triangle. It's a Hindu-Muslim caste triangle. And so it will be, because this is not a two-way story. And for the story of India's religions and for Hindutva's origins, they don't think so much about caste. I mean, they might think about it in terms of, today's calculations of, elections and so on, whatnot. But the main problem is Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism.
Let me examine a couple of strands which seem slightly contradictory. One of which is from your book, where you write beautifully of how Savarkar, for Savarkar's Hindutva was, quote, a theory of violence in search of its own history. Stop quote. And I just love that phrase, in search of its own history.
You.
Then you elaborate upon that when you say, quote, the cobbled together history invoked by Hindutva was meant to provide it not with a past so much as a future, a prognostic operation that sought to read into the past, a future in which India was not identified by land, blood, or history, but had to be produced by war. Hindutva, as expounded by Savarkar, the book argues, is a theory of violence rather than a history of identity, which is superbly put. Now, so on the one hand, I completely buy what you're saying here, that, the history that Savarkar tries to invoke to justify his theory of violence, as you say, simply wasn't there. It was made up. It was, some could argue fictional, and some could argue that even Nehru's idea of India was fictional in some sense, and some could argue everything is fictional. But the other sort of aspect of that is how Indian society was even at that time. Like, I did an episode with Akshay Mukul on his superb book on the Gita Press. And one of the things that I kind of realized while reading that book and while chatting with him and doing that episode was that English speaking elites like me were really grew up in India in a bubble where we didn't really have a true sense of a lot of Indian society. Like a lot of the factors of the present, the fault lines of the present, are there in the 1920s, 1910s, even going further back, right? So, issues which to some people may seem like modern issues, like the revival of love jihad or cow slaughter or so
But
on,
they seem
were
very 20s to me. Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
were very live 1920s issues, and they were already burning there. So on the one hand, the specific theory of Hindutva, as Savarkar kind of built it up, and the justifications he made for it in his made up history, might not hold much water. But the point is the sentiments that they played to, the fissures that were within society were very kind of real.
No. I think you're right. Let me just kind of unpack a few things here. So I'm not saying it is fiction. In fact, Savarkar is very clear. He goes against his initial mentor. It's not that Tilak is a direct kind of relationship, but yeah, they had some conversations, and Tilak is instrumental in sending him to London at that point in early the 20th century. But having said that, he's opposed to Tilak and other figures because he's not interested in the epic tradition. He's actually saying, no, history is what is verifiable, recordable. So he's not saying good. This is fantasy land. But what I'm trying to say is, for how does he organize? So let's compare him with Nehru and him. Both of them use the same time frame to write about the two books of Indian history. One is, of course, Discovery of India, written in 46, in which India is made into a civilizational grandeur. It's divided into three phases, and the British have is a kind of, the third phase is the last one, where the kind of moral struggle of empire against nation. But Nehru is making the claim of Discovery of India primarily is that, look, India is not going to be Europe because it is going to forge a nationality out of diversity. This is the point. Like the Germans, the French also pretty much invented Frenchness. The Germans, Bismarck and all that, the rest, we know the whole story, and of course the English civil wars and the like. But the point was that in the end, a linguistic homogeneity, a racial or religious homogeneity provided the basis of modern nation states in Europe, which of course led to the two world wars. We also know that this was not a cost-free thing. Nehru's point is that this is not who we are. This is not what India is. It will defy this trajectory of nationality making. This phrase we love to mock now, the unity in diversity, was precisely Nehru's claim that out of diversity we will produce a nationality in India. And the labor of Discovery of India is precisely that, right? That India has this kind of destiny to occupy. And interestingly for him, since you mentioned Schmidt at the beginning, neither, since he was a Marxist, he had read everything a lot. He doesn't organize history around evil forces or even class warfare. It's very abstract rise and fall. There's this progress, there's decline. They're like forces, but he never names, there are no enemies to be had in terms of human beings or groups. Very interesting. Savarkar, also the same 2 millennium. And he says, and this is Six Glorious Epochs, written in 66, I think, or 62, I can't remember, but 60s. And it's his last book before he commits suicide. And, the book is really fascinating because, like all his other works in history, it's organized around war. Yeah. So there's 6 glorious epochs in Indian history which have given India an identity, starting with the Shakas, but the main one is, as I said, Buddhism and Islam. And he's basically saying, India's history is pretty static. And the only thing that gives it any dynamism is war. These are the 6 wars that matter. And that's why I'm saying when I read it, I thought, oh my God, this is a kind of interesting take. Like, I haven't kind of seen the slicing of Indian history in this manner before. But then I was like, what is he doing at? Because if you word search the book, the word Hindutva is not used at all, maybe once. So I'm like, what is this? He has written this pamphlet where, it's a kind of elaboration of that pamphlet. And that's when I realized that initially he's looking for purity in India and he can't find it. And then he wants to kind of uses these as obstacles to overcome. So these are the obstacles Hindutva will have to overcome. And in the end, he's very clear that he's saying that, new identities are made on the anvil of war. And even on talking about Muslims, he's saying, well, friendship is possible with the Muslims, but only after they have been defeated. He's very clear that, war will lead to real peace. And so I think it's not fictive history, but whether it is Nehru, whether it is Savarkar, whether it's indeed Iqbal and his philosophical history, or, even Ambedkar's turn to India's ancient history, they're all using history as the template to convey political ideas of India's future. So they don't write philosophical texts. They write history to say, well, this is our political vision. So it's not the way I would write history as a professional historian, right? But there is a problem in the sense that appears when we talk about today's generation or what have you. History will always be tied up to state narratives. And when you say that English elites have a very kind of poor understanding of India's, or had, today they can't claim to have that. They can't they can't claim to be naive, it's everywhere. So, but, perhaps, in the 70s, 80s, they were buffeted. The question really is like, I mean, if I were to be completely honest, and I don't want to be controversial at all, I think in the 50s and 60s, this is not my decade. I was not born then. I was born in the 70s. So, the effort of India's intellectual elites, and this was I think it was a good-hearted thing. It was not a bad, malicious thing. Let me be very clear. It was a good idea. They wanted to look for sources in the past for India's secularism, for India's diversity. And I think that was, a mistake, because what they should have actually done is say that India's secularism, like Chandigarh, is a bold new project into the future. And it would have been better, because then we wouldn't have had these. Then I think, what would Hindutva have done? Would then Babri Masjid be such a big issue? If you are saying, well, it is, this is our new charter. It's what actually the Turks did, I'm not saying we should have gone the Turkey way, but, because, I don't know, there was lack of, confidence, or maybe they genuinely believed that all of this existed in the past. I'm not saying the past was bad or good, conflict-ridden or peaceful, but I'm not sure if the Mughal polity was the right paradigm for the secular state. And I think looking for that answer in the Mughal polity, though I can see where they were coming from, became not an open invitation, but it opened the floodgates for the wars we have seen in the last 20 years over Hindu-Muslim past, and starting with Babri Masjid. And yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. In fact, this is a point made by previous guests on my show, like Kapil Komireddy, who wrote Palavolent Republic, and Manu Pillai has been on the show. And both of them kind of agreed that, look, if we took a different approach to history, if we didn't just try to, paint everything, paint history as something where there was no communal problem, where the Mughals didn't do anything wrong, and so on and so forth, we wouldn't see the backlash. And the interesting, and I love the way you brought Chandigarh into there, that sell it as a new project entirely and let's see where it goes, where in that case the arguments would not have been over the positive or how things are, but over the normative and how things should be.
Absolutely. And they would have had a bolder compact. We would have had a bolder way of dealing with issues. Now, the problem is that, and I don't blame the founding figures because, look, they have seen a catastrophic fratricide in which 1 million people have killed using house knives and, whatnot. You didn't even need state machinery to have this killing machine, which, it shocks me that in, 6, 7 months, so many people were killed without, great technology or even state backing. And I think they probably were too, I wouldn't say scared, they were too stymied, they were too shocked by that violence to actually then want to say something. So their effort was to say, no, actually, look, we were peaceful once upon a time, we could live together, we could coexist. And these are the examples, look at the past. And it's not all a lie. After all, these are not like lies, but they're, I would say, inadequate. They were inadequate ways of thinking about secularism or living with each other. And I think, yeah, I mean, and that's why now you have a complete reversal where the Mughals are just the bad guys, and you think, really, I mean, have you seen the architecture? Have you seen the kind of growth in the human sciences and the medicinal sciences in that period, or the number of cities that came up? But no, there's a kind of way, no, it's all kind of love jihad type of stuff, that this is about conversion, it's about, it's about power. And so I think it was an error. I don't think it was just bad history. I think it was good history, but it was an error to teach, to make the past an instruction for India's future. Because what actually India was doing was something totally new.
Yeah, and firstly, obviously, it's easy for you and me to sit here and in hindsight say, oh, they should have done this and done that. But, when the country's falling apart around them and they're wondering, will the center hold? What are you going to do? I'd actually go a little further and postulate that this error was a small error which was part of a larger error of a way of looking at the world. Like, one theme that I've often explored in this episode, and I've put this question to many people, is that our society by and large was an illiberal society. You can just see this in the sort of the sales of the Gita Press books, like, how women should behave and all of that nonsense, right? And that our society by and large was illiberal, and we had a bunch of liberal elites who were not elected at the time of writing the constitution, who therefore wrote a constitution which is not as liberal as I would like it to be, but is way more liberal than society itself. So you have the imposition of a liberal constitution, quote unquote, upon an illiberal society by a liberal elite. And the question there is, number one, and this is a smaller question, number one, can that imposition itself be called liberal? And number two, leaving that earlier question aside, number two, is this sort of top-down thinking, is it possible for this to actually change society into something liberal? Like, Ambedkar himself spoke of the constitution as a topsoil, right? There was an understanding that this is just a start. Now, there was a faith among some that you can drive change top down, and certainly Nehru had this faith that you can drive change top down, and and this is part of the mindset from which that thing emerges, that let's whitewash history and let's give a particular version of it, and these are the needs of the time. But Gandhi argued at the time in the sense, before he passed, that real change will only come from within society. It will come in a bottom-up way. Politics is downstream of culture, as Breitbart once said. So, and that's, I think, a failure of understanding among our leaders, because that top-down vision of changing India from the top did not work on any margin, right? And therefore, we have the India that we have today, where I like to say that society has caught up with politics, that now the politics that we see is a reflection of the society that we live in. And for people like me, and I'm sure you, it's an ugly sight. But the point is, it's also, I think, a failure of imagination back then, and a failure on the part of liberals through all of these decades to be able to do the bottom-up work they should have done.
Well, really fascinating, fantastic, and not easy questions to answer. But they also are questions which are out one's own positions a little bit more than I'm more comfortable in doing. But okay, I'll give it a try. So let me first say, in my book, I was very careful I did not organize my book around any ideology, because my claim is that India's founding figures tore up the copybook particularly of liberalism, but also Marxism or conservatism or what have you, to put a new set of norms in place on democracy and on violence and on asking the question of where does political change come from. So that's the question about whether I think Nehru is a liberal or not is therefore not not the most pertinent question to me. But of course, what is the fundamental division from this period, and a fundamental political and psychic division, is the division that we are now seeing in India between Hindutva and another way of living. Now, that could be called the idea of India, or you could call it Gandhi, you could call it anything. I would say it's a psychic division between Gandhi and Savarkar. It is not, so Nehru is more in the middle. You're not middle in the sense he's a kind of figure on the Gandhi side for sure. But unlike Gandhi, he's not so much top-down guy. He does believe that the state can be an agent for public good. That the state is not simply a manager of different interests or setting up rules of the game and okay, then you can live, But the state can be an active agent in making India's society move ahead, right? Now, you could say it's a pedagogical project. It's a tutelary project. He wants to educate Indians, but he also has a belief because, again, he's not thinking about, unlike Patel, and Patel himself says that about Nehru. Patel says that he could never have been prime minister. All these controversies are quite silly because Patel himself said he would never be prime minister because he had no interest in the wider world. Nehru is very interested in also giving India an identity in the world. It's not just an internal identity, but what would it look like to the world, in the world? And I think for him, the experience of empire, having said that empire didn't, they get rid of it. It's a sad past, and the empire above all stands for India's economic and degradation. It's not simply a political servitude, which it is. So therefore, it's a very mid-century thing to be doing, which is to say that he puts a huge amount of faith in science and scientism to kind of overcome this problem. That it's not simply about religious division, it's not simply about caste division. He really thinks that the promises of human creativity, whether it's in the arts or whether it is in the sciences particularly, will see, which is why the money to IITs, which is why the money to higher education, because he wants that flourishing of talent, which can see India out of this kind of misery that it's in. So in a way, that could be seen as noblesse oblige. It could be seen as, patronizing. It could have been seen as, tutelary. It could be seen as something ambitious, what have you. I think the question whether India's society was unfit or was out of sync with these ideas, I think is a more difficult one to agree with, because I'll not say because Indians were liberal. That's not what I'm going to say. But that actually the language of politics that won out was Gandhi's. And Nehru too belonged to that. So what does Gandhi do? And why does he have to be assassinated? I was asked this phenomenal question by a very eminent Indian political leader whom I shall not name. They asked me this question: why do you think they assassinated? Why did an former RSS member assassinate Gandhi but not Nehru? And, given that Gandhi was old, he would have died anyway. He was fasting himself to death all the time anyway. They were not being facetious, but I thought the question was a very interesting question, given that it's Nehru who has the agenda for secularism. But Gandhi's assassins were correct to identify him as the main enemy because Gandhi tapped into that very important way of being in India, and so that's why whether it's the farmers' strike, whether it is, so there's a way in which Gandhi tapped into existing social, and so in that sense, Gandhi is a conservative. you could say Gandhi is a conservative and Nehru is a progressive, because Gandhi doesn't want to change the conditions of life as they appear. He really likes, that there are these obligations we have to our relatives, to our parents, whatever, the sort of system that of obligations and duties. Nehru is much more of the progressive kind, like there is individual flourishing, individual self-making, and, growth. Very different ways. But Gandhi's, why does Gandhi win? Because Gandhi, for one, says that this partitioning of religion from politics is a joke. It is not just a joke, it is inhuman and it is impossible. You cannot ask someone to leave their skin behind when they walk into the public arena. So the starting point of politics has to be a kind of not just mutual regard, but this kind of intense responsibility to my own religion, but also to your religion. And that, in a way, was a challenge of Gandhi's politics, which is why he can, fight for the Khilafat, he can fight for, So he's saying, well, one should die for the right of the Muslim to practice their religion. This is his argument. His argument is precisely that, and so there's a kind of set of passages in my book on Gandhi, which will make you look at Gandhi as a social conservative, because he's opposed to interdining and he's opposed to even intermarriage between Hindus and Muslims. And he's not opposed in a big way, but he's basically saying, respect comes, the power of religion comes if I protect not just I have faith in my religion, but I also have faith for you to have faith in your religion. So let's open it up in terms of the Mapela riots that take place. And, they came up again in India's political controversy. And Gandhi scolds both Hindus and Muslims. So he tells the Hindus, you are playing the victim card now. You're saying, that happened to you. But where is the strength in your own religion, in your own religious belief, to protect your own? He says, so if the Muslim is a so-called bully, the Hindu is a coward, so-called coward. And he says both these categories come from a politics of fear. And what we need to do is attain a fearlessness, but also a fearlessness which is, as I said, not just mutual respect, but a profound. The only way we can have a better relationship with each other is if we are good Hindus and if we are good Muslims. That's his point. Yeah. Asking someone to convince each other that, my religion is better than yours. He says, this is not just an inhuman idea. It's an inhuman thing, but it is also the starting point. It comes from a politics of fearlessness, of fear rather. It comes from a politics of fear because you fear the other's religion, which is why you want to say, no, you. So he wants this kind of word that I use from Lacan, which means extremacy. He wants, it's not the opposite of intimacy, but extremacy means you throw a bridge where there is too much separation and you create a separation where there is too much closeness. So it's a kind of, to go back to the hedgehogs, it's about how to have that distance to live well without having to convert, overcome, absorb, which is what Hindutva wants to do, or the multicultural fix, like, you and I will meet on these terms on this day, and you can have your pork and I can have my beef, or whatever, it's not doing that. It's actually saying, well, you must live like a Muslim and I must live like whatever, like a Hindu. And that's why, his politics is a radical embrace of religion, and that's why he's very hard to characterize, which is precisely why Nathuram Godse kills him. And when he kills him, he calls him the father of Pakistan. That's the word he utters in his confession. So anyway, so I find it fascinating that we have more our figures who were so immersed every day. They are working so hard, they're in politics, they also thought so hard and wrote so much about these problems. We don't see that any longer. Our politicians don't really write any longer. uh,
Yeah, they don't even write their own tweets. And I'm
that's
really glad you I'm really glad you explained the word extremacy to me, because otherwise I would have assumed it's the ecstasy which comes from intimacy. And pictures of Savarkar and Gandhi and Nehru doing funky things would have floated around in my head, but no more. Um, Couple of kind of thoughts. One is, you pointed out that you're not painting our society as liberal, and I agree with you. I feel it's deeply illiberal. But there was an interesting counterpoint posed to me, which I can't get myself to disagree with also. When I pointed this out to the politician JP Narayan in an episode we did together, he pointed out that, one, he said, of course, he agrees with me. And he asked me to elaborate, and one can talk about caste and gender and a hazar other things, right? But he said, if you look at it in another way, there is a liberal element to our culture as well, in the sense that it is so assimilative. We take in influences from everywhere. Even our beloved prime minister's churidar kurtas are, have an Islamic influence. And though he didn't, this is my example, not his, so don't go after him kindly, if any trolls are listening to this, and so on and so forth. And I found that an interesting kind of way to put it, that there is also that's trend. And when you sort of spoke of, Gandhi and Savarkar being at completely opposite ends, and Nehru being somewhere in the middle, and in the way that, the central point of the debate, as I see it, which is, the relationship between society and politics being downstream of culture, I actually think that, Nehru was at the politics end in an extreme way, where he believed that politics could change culture and shape society. And Gandhi and Savarkar were really at the other end, but in different ways, where Gandhi had a recognition of how powerful traditions were and how important it is in a practical sense to respect them and go one step at a time, and not try to use state coercion to sort of reform society. Whereas, Savarkar obviously had his own political purposes, and that had him sort of stressing that aspect of it. So that is sort of the question that I struggle with, that if Gandhi's project was, let's reform society from inside, was that ever possible, or were we on a fast train hurtling to exactly where we are?
Okay, so this is super. I mean, I think this is a super question because so Gandhi, has this big fight with Ambedkar in the 30s, in the Pune Pact. Maharashtra is really interesting. It's really the wellspring of politics. I'm hoping that now that there's a new kind of politics going on there, so it shall be for where Maharashtra starts, India lands. They always say that about Bengal, but I actually think it's Maharashtra. But it's interesting that, so, you had the Pune Pact. Okay, so for the listeners who might not know, a very simple kind of quick history lesson, that after Gandhi's very famous salt satyagraha, which actually was not triggered by any pre-existing demand, but it's Gandhi's kind of sui generis question around the prohibition of the prohibitive nature of taxation around salt, but it's also about economy and poverty and empire. Anyway, I write a little bit about it. But it's really, to me, that's the moment when India's democracy becomes a fait accompli. That is when the foundations of that moment is when India's democracy comes to be. Because what does Gandhi do then? He's saying, well, I'm going to walk out of my ashram and I'm going to walk whatever it is, 60 odd miles or 80 odd kilometers down, or 200, I don't know the exact distance between there and to Dandi, where I'm going to break open salt on the open shorelines, and as a public defiance of the state, of the prohibitive, He walks with a handful of his, followers, and by the time when he finishes the act, hundreds of thousands have walked with him. Yeah. And I saw this, in the National Museum in Delhi. They had the Pathe clip of the, I saw actually the visuals they had, put on the exhibition about 2 years ago. It's just striking, the kind of people who are walking with him. Men, women, children, and But that's also foundational to India's democracy. But it also kind of tells you the most about Gandhi. It tells you a lot about Gandhi, because so it's a very plain language. So it's both very plain, it's both very simple, but at also the same time incredibly demanding of the individual. Yeah. So his politics is that it's a politics of the plain, of breaking the abstract stuff with something which can be embodied, which can be experienced, and it's at the level of the self. And so he's not doing what we now understand as political mobilization, rallies and hundreds of, crores being spent, people being bussed in, and then all the visual kind of, power play. Gandhi understands the power of visuality. Let's not get it wrong. But, he's one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. But he's interesting because he uses that as a kind of grammar to convey something very powerful. It's not always shock and awe, but the image becomes a way of communicating, like his own body, which is a very frail body. It's an ascetic's body. It looks the opposite of, say, Hitler and Stalin and Churchill, which are military bodies of this period. They're the people driving world history. They are the big men with, the super strong men. And here is a frail old man who will undo the empire. And he will deploy that visual language. So it's different kind of politics, but he wants, all this to say, he wants change to not take place at the level of institutions. He doesn't really care about institutions. He's an anarchist in that sense. Someone, Vasudevji actually calls him as an anarchist thinker. I'm not sure, but what he is really saying, that there can only be one form of transformation, and that's a transformation of the self. You can change, I can change. Without it, nothing, whether the British come and go, they can enable or disable conditions, but that's not really important. And he's anti-imperial, to be sure. And this is the heart of the debate between him and Ambedkar. So you have the Salt Satyagraha, which has just happened, which is basically announced to Ramsay MacDonald, the British Prime Minister, that Gandhi cannot no longer be ignored. What is going on in India can no longer be ignored. So you have the roundtable conferences, which then in London, at the highest level of the imperial table, to really decide what a kind of dominion status or the kind of, what is going to be the constitutional architecture of division of power. And in the first round, Gandhi's not even there, and Ambedkar in the first round has proposed that the Dalits be treated and designated as a minority. So this was because Muslims were designated as a minority, and what it meant was that they were separate electorates. Okay, there was not much to fight for, but it was a municipal corporation of Bombay, or the kind of, that time the Legislative Assembly elections had also not come in, but whatever limited franchise there was, it meant that Dalits would get separate representation. And they should be recognized as a minority. And actually, it's all going to plan. No one is, even Jinnah is fine with it. Like, everyone's fine with it. Gandhi gets wind of it, and he then, in the second round table, comes in and, as we know, declares a fast unto death if this is to be done. And this infamously leads to the Pune Pact, where, Ambedkar would drop the demand for that. And the people think of this, and there's a lot of misunderstanding of this problem. People think of it that somehow Gandhi is an upper caste figure. Now, that's far from the case, because Gandhi's own marriage with Kasturba has come under a fair amount of stress, because in the ashrams, he is expecting not just her, but himself. He is doing so-called menial work of toilet cleaning and the like, right? And this is like heretical. Kasturba is not happy about it and the like. But, so there's a kind of caste politics to him, but also he has been part of the temple entry movement in the Guru, in southern India and the like. So he wants the Dalits to be able to enter temples. So Gandhi is no figure of, but where he is different from, so what he's saying is that upper caste, as he would normally say, I'm touchable by birth, but untouchable by habit. I'm untouchable, basically. By practice, I'm an untouchable. So what he wants it to happen is that caste can only be broken down if we start transgressing its taboos. So upper caste men and women start behaving in ways that are, that they would not. And the Dalits will get temple entry, education, all the things that they have been barred from. And that's how you kind of delegitimize and you finish off the caste system. Ambedkar is saying, you're right. He's saying, you're right, this is going to happen, right? So the fight is that. The fight is not that, he's some kind of, casteist. Ambedkar is saying, well, you can't rely on the goodwill of people. So I don't think, what I'm trying to say is that I don't think Gandhi is not on the side of change. He's on the side of change, but his side of change is so ascetic, so demanding, that it is an impossible demand on humans. And I don't mean the temples question or the taboo question, but even in terms of, say, celibacy, silence, his remaking of the self is based on a kind of self-abnegation, which is, unsustainable. And therefore, Gandhi's politics was not reproducible, But what is reproducible, what stays, is this grammar of civil disobedience, of the power of restraint, of really politics of the plain. So whether you have environmentalism, the Chipko movement, or whether you have the farmers' strike today, it all is Gandhi, where you can, and that the state is not, you're not beholden to the state. And Ambedkar would be more on the Nehru side, at least initially. Of course, he would disown the constitution before he dies, where that actually, the law can guarantee a sense of progress and equity. That, you can make the state a mechanism of equity, of even progress and change. So, but what is good about India, or what is interesting about India, is that you have more than one idea. And the person who said to you that India is liberal, I would not use the word liberal, but I would say Indians, a large number of, even some, perhaps even Hindutva types, I'm not sure, but there's a degree of openness in India, which is, it's a kind of receptive culture, and not just that it wants to receive things, but it then owns it up and makes it its own. Like the Lutyens buildings, which, may have been made by Edward Lutyens, but someone like me, driving past, those buildings, I don't think of them as British buildings. I think of Nehru walking them down, or, I think of, Indira Gandhi, or I think of, Deve Gowda, or, whoever, I don't imagine British figures inhabiting it. And that's the thing that's what I think, that where India is not liberal in the sense of what we traditionally call liberal, which is that it is not a society based on a social contract. It's not based on a kind of contractualism. Anyway.
This is also fascinating, and I'm looking to sort of continue this forward and kind of dive deeper into your book and indeed in your growing up years in Chandigarh. But let's take a quick commercial break first. Have you always wanted to be a writer but never quite gotten down to it? Well, I'd love to help you. Since April 2020, I've taught 20 cohorts of my online course, The Art of Clear Writing. An online community has now sprung up of all my past students. We have workshops, a newsletter to showcase the work of students, and vibrant community interaction. In the course itself, through 4 webinars spread over 4 weekends, I share all I know about the craft and practice of clear writing. There are many exercises, much interaction, a lovely and lively community at the end of it. The course costs Rs 10,000 per GST, or about $150, and is a monthly thing. So if you're interested, head on over to register at indiauncut.com/clearwriting. That's indiauncut.com/clearwriting. Being a good writer doesn't require God given talent, just the willingness to work hard and a clear idea of what you need to do to refine your skills. I can help you. Welcome back to the Scene and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Shruti Kapila, and I've been just getting like her book is full of way more insights than we can possibly encapsulate in even a 10-hour conversation. But while I've been getting tons of insights on, Tilak, Nehru, Gandhi, Savarkar, all of these people, many of my listeners must be thinking that, hey, we've heard about these people before. We'd rather hear the history of Shruti Kapila herself, which which I want to get back to because, hey, Chandigarh, right? And also I was reading about your parents, and they're both kind of fascinating people. So that's particularly also what I want to sort of talk about, your childhood and the influences that they had on you and so on and so forth. So tell me a bit about your father was, of course, a career journalist for decades and all of that, covered Haryana, Punjab. And your mom was a well-known writer. She wrote her
Yes,
first book apparently when
yes,
she was
yes.
12 years old.
Yeah. 16, yeah. So 12 or 13, I can't remember, but yeah. Yeah, my mom, yeah, I mean, I come from, I suppose, a fairly writerly background, but quite different styles. My father was, as you say, a career journalist, and so much more engaged with the world and into quite a lot of politics. And so he was very formative. He's been a formative influence on me because he was very interested in politics, political ideas, how political ideas led to certain forms of power. So he was interested in those things. He never wrote and a book, as it were. And then my mother was slightly different. She was more aesthetic, interested in more in aesthetics, like culture stuff. So, Chandigarh, had a very vibrant theater and art scene. And so she would, drag us all to, I'm one of three. We'd all be like taken to, exhibitions and concerts, and and at that point you thought, oh my God, what the hell am I doing listening to this? I remember feeling terribly bored and wanting to sleep. I shall not name the theater group, but a very prominent theater group in Chandigarh, which would put up these Sanskrit plays. And I would be like, oh my God, what is this? And now, of course, the minute, when you hit undergraduate years or graduate years, you're like, you feel so lucky that you've actually seen some of these plays, and that same Rich Katikam or, whatever, Ghasiram Kothlal is not in the same league, but, you've seen all of it, you've seen a large bit of it. So I think I was very lucky because whether it was art, I was given a kind of training into reading and listening, but just by osmosis. It wasn't like it wasn't kind of didactic that you must do this or you mustn't do that. And yeah, so I think there's a kind of, my mother was on the kind of, I would say, reclusive side in life, when my father was the more gregarious person. And I think, I have that too, in the sense I quite like engaging with a large number of people. But I also quite like my solitary kind of work in the libraries and the archives and writing. And so they've had a huge impact in the way that I thought I would actually become a journalist. When I was a school kid, I always, if, colleagues, students, sort of classmates asked, I would always be very clear. The answer was, yeah, I'm going to be a journalist. But somehow, I think not to kind of to drive too fine a point or to overdo this, but I think my generation grew up with a lot of violence in India. So whether we were directly affected by it or not is, so particularly if you were born in the 70s, the aftermath of the emergency, followed by the kind of militancy and insurgency and counterinsurgency for 12 years plus in Punjab, more like 78 to 92, 91. It's a long period. That's pretty much my entire childhood, really, or it's not childhood but my till adulthood, really. And then you come out and then there's Babri Masjid, and so it goes, and you feel that actually, so I think I was resistant to working in journalism, partly because I thought that I did some work, but I thought it didn't feel, not in a negative way, it didn't feel satisfying. I felt I wanted to know more. I liked the adrenaline and the kind of the buzz of doing something new every day. It appealed to that. It appealed, but it did not satisfy the the deeper questions as to why, the deeper political questions or historical questions of India, and I think the training at JNU was formative. So I only studied 2 years in JNU. I only did my master's there. And it really was. Every generation in JNU says that, oh, they had the best time. I would say that my teachers were at their peak when I met them. So my teachers were brilliant teachers, and it was interesting because, they were also, they were not no longer part of the state's agenda of writing Indian history, nor were they part of subaltern studies, which was, the rage in at that time. So yeah, I had really charismatic teachers, and that kind of made it like, and I think history from the get go in India has been the site of political argument. So I think I was interested in political argument, and that's why I ended up writing history, is what I'm saying.
I want to ask you a lot more about your teachers in JNU and what the time there was like. But before that, I want to kind of circle a little back to childhood. And again, my parents were pretty involved in the cultural scene there as well. So I feel this great regret that they're not around. So I can't ask them that, hey, did you know the Kapilas and whatever? Who knows what? We might even have sat next to each other while watching some concert or something. So these serendipities. Tell me about the kind of things you read, and also in particular what interests me is that your mother was a writer in Hindi. She wrote books. Her first book was Bhatke Rahi, and then her last book was
Yes.
Samne Ka Asman and all that. And that also strikes me as very fascinating, because what I have increasingly come to realize with the passing of years is that, on the one hand, we are incredibly lucky to be in a rich multilingual country like India, where you have the diversity of so many languages. But I often curse myself for only bothering to understand one and learn one really well. Like, of course, I can converse in multiple other languages, but I haven't read the literature of multiple other languages in the original, and I feel that that's a loss. And different worlds are shut off to you because of that reason. While unlike Europeans, we had the opportunity to enter these different worlds. So, did you read in Hindi as well? Was that also part of your influences growing up?
So thank you. That's a very nice question. And actually, two things strike me. That one, that we were never told to read. Ye padho, it wasn't like this. But my parents had a large number of poets and authors as friends. So, there was, as I said, osmosis, from Chandigarh, but also from the region, and both Punjabi, but also Hindi writing. So, like someone like Teji Grover, who's a very famous poet now, she used to kind of hang out with us when we were kids. And I was like, I was thinking about it the other day, that poor woman, she must be in her late 20s, and we were like these kids, running over her house. So India's fun like that, like people are not so policing about, okay, you must only hang out with your age or the like. But so, you had people like that, or even Kumar Vikal, who was, of course, a very famous poet from Chandigarh. And so they were all part of my parents' circle at one point or another. So they were just there as human beings. I mean, they were not reading poetry to us. It wasn't that kind of influence. But my father was multilingual also, in the sense that in Punjabi, Hindi, and Urdu. And I remember when I was doing my research in Bombay for my PhD on asylums and psychoanalysis, I thought I'd surprise him. So I spent 5 months, getting a tutor from actually Muhammad Ali Road to come to me to teach me Urdu. And so I thought, oh, I'll go home and I'll impress my dad. And so I went after 5, 6 months home, and I said, guess what? I know Urdu. And I wrote, he says, okay, likho kuch. He says, so I started writing stuff. And he says, well, this is not Urdu, this is Arabic. What have we learned? So, so of course things change. So there was always an idea to kind of have a kind of very thick linguistic register in more than one language and to be attuned to different languages. Of course, English was also like, it wasn't like, and my mother was very, I would say, she was not opposed to English. She was not an anti-Angrezi Vad, because, there was also that sentiment that, is always a known in India that, but she never really, my mother was a more complex person in the sense that she was probably the most modern person I know, if I can use that word. Her last book is the last published book. She's got a book in press which will come out next year. Unfortunately, she died before she could see that out. But, her last published book is actually based on it's on homosexuality. And so these are not topics that you associate, at least with kind of Hindi writers per se, or, so she had a very modern, very contemporary mindset. But her linguistic register always remained Hindi. And, and I thought that was kind of, again, a kind of confidence, which I like, which I've been, I admired, and I've been a kind of beneficiary of, which is why that I feel I can inhabit different cultures without feeling inferior, superior, or having to fit myself in or out. And I think that comes from the multiple linguistic registers at home as well. Because, of course, English is a political issue in India. And I was aware of the debates around English throughout, also through some other teachers in growing up, but particularly around my mother on that thing. So what are the kind of books I read? Okay, so now I'm going to be like a bit, how do I put it? Like, I was not a big reader in school. I was a very decent student in school. Like, I did, whatever. I was school captain and whatnot. Those sorts of things that come, in childhood. I would say I was more or less an obedient, good bacha. Which, given my school was strict, meant I was very good. So, I came from a very strict pro-science, not particularly good on humanities or encouraging on the humanities school. Sacred Heart was very, all my classmates, wonderful as they are from school, have ended up becoming mostly doctors and, engineers and, and mothers and, so forth.
Thereby doing some good to society, unlike you academics.
No, I don't say I do any good.
I was kidding.
But but I was like a fish out of water by the time I was, 16 in that school, 15, 16, because, and I couldn't be, and, when class 10 finished and we had the option to go to, at that point, +2 was in a college. You didn't have schools because it was one of the first years to move to that +2 kind of thing. And it was in government college for girls, in Chandigarh, which is, of course, considered to be a kind of, I don't know, a finishing school, if I may say so. Or like, rather than, it's supposed to be more like, it's not really known for its academic strength, let's put it like that. And, but it was a wonderful, freeing time for me to get out of the whole, the kind of the pressure of science, the conformism of a convent school, the kind of uniform, it was a terribly strict school. I mean, now I think about it and I think, oh my God, this was out of the Edwardian 1920s, 30s period, the regimes we had, the disciplinary regimes we had. So, and then I kind of, stumbled into history because history was not really my main subject. It was meant to be politics. And then, but I, not just did very well in it in my +2, but I really enjoyed it. And I found actually the study of the Indian Constitution and all that a bit too like, okay, whatever, it was a bit like, yeah, okay, and so then I took an honors in history. And I was also interested in psychology, so that was my minor. So GCG was was Chandigarh was undergraduate years were again quite lonesome, I would say, because people were not interested in reading. So that's when I really stumbled upon Freud. I still have my first book here, right here, I ever bought. And yeah, I just thought, it's just kind of, and so because GCG had a very strong department in psychology. And they had therefore the books in the library. That meant there was a lot of Freud, there was a lot of Jung, and the library was where, so it was fine. The girls were interested in what they are interested. They were quite girly. They were interested in marriage, boys, the kind of normal things teenagers are into. But I was more serious than I give myself credit for. And at that point I was a bit like, I was always a bit off the loop, I would say, though I had a large number of friends. But then the formative thing happened, and there was, because of militancy, there wasn't student government or kind of things that I would have liked to have been involved in, like even party politics. Nothing was available because you didn't have union, you didn't have politics, student politics at that point in any way. And but what happened was that I went to a lecture. I think it was Tapan Ray Chowdhury, who was then the professor of history in Oxford, and he came to speak in the Gandhi Bhavan. And I was in my +2, actually. I was in class 12. And so still in school, technically. And I asked a question about something, I don't know, but I asked a question. I was journalist's daughter, I suppose, or whatever. And I came out, and it was kind of preposterous now I think about it, like, right, barely 17 or something, and asking, But the good side was that as I walked out of the Gandhi Bhavan, two people approached me, and one of them was Yogendra Yadav, the head of Swaraj India now, and the other was a former head of department now in history in Chandigarh, called Rajiv Lochan. So what happens is that they say, "Oh, who are you? What are you doing?" So they just kind of introduce yourselves, and I'm like, "Okay, I'm just like I'm basically a teenager, and he just no, but I was interested. They said, "Oh, well, are you interested in books and ideas?" And I was like, "Yeah, I really am." And so this is we have a study group, we have a study circle, and would you mind coming to it? And I was like, wow. And it was appropriately called SAD, Serious Academic Discussion. So that was actually very useful for me. That was my outlet. And so we would read, my sister was also part of it. And, we would read quite serious books. And, we would read like Foucault, we would read subaltern studies, these are things that were not available to me in the curriculum. The curriculum was all about, you had to learn the kunji. I was a university topper, as they call it. Topper, I'm told, is an Indian word. But yeah, I topped the university in history. But, that curriculum was not the interesting thing. The university curriculum, though good, was not what was animating me. It was the discussions in SAD which really then propelled me into academia.
Do you remember any of those early discussions or any books or thinkers that really, just blew your mind and made you just want to dive in deeper, deeper, deeper?
Yeah, so I remember, like, I used to, I was interested in, I was interested in Freud. They didn't read much Freud there at all. They didn't read. Freud was more of a private interest. They were interested in, political philosophy and the like. We would read, I mean, most what I remember is reading Parthachat, like Indian writers, on politics, Chatterjee, Kaviraj. But those, I don't remember having an influence of those figures as much as what stayed was the ability to discuss and debate ideas. I would say that was more important to me. The books that really transformed or motivated me, I would say Freud is just one definite abiding kind of interest of mine. But it was really in JNU that I discovered reading more seriously and more, in a more disciplined way, when you read a book and you kind of tried to understand where it came from and read it critically. And there, I think the person in Indian history who completely was spellbinding for me was Bernard Cohn from Chicago, and his book, An Anthropologist Amongst Historians. And I remember I had just got my prize for, whatever, for coming first in Punjab University. I should laugh, but so I got some prize money, and I remember my father coming and meeting me and giving it to me. And then, I went to, I was not a Delhi person, so I didn't know Delhi very much at all. But I went to now the defunct Fact and Fiction in Vasant Vihar, and I sat there. I'd been going there on and off because of Priya Cinema, and I would see this book and I would read a bit, and then I actually bought it. And then that was my first possession, if I can use that word, in Indian history. And I spent most of my money, that little paltry sum, put towards whatever on that book. But I've carried it with me. So I would say that Bernard Cohn's writing on India were formative for me. And I thought, the way that him, and then I had a very good teacher who's not very well known, but but he has really created a generation of students, I think. His name is Majid Siddiqui, and he taught at JNU, and he now lives in Goa, I think. And so he's just kind of like, he taught very innovative courses. He taught incredibly innovative courses in JNU. And then, of course, many people must have mentioned, I don't know, Niladri Bhattacharya, so Niladri and Majid were I would say, the two main teachers in JNU. Majid, because he really took ideas seriously, conceptual history, but also was very at ease with reading the Western historical and theoretical canon. So it was a kind of, I was in and out. I mean, I kind of, walked, so I didn't find JNU as a campus very good or comfortable. So, but I think what I take from JNU is it were the teaching, were the teachers.
I'm very interested in how the ways that we look at the world are formed. Like, just when I look back at myself, I find that, you're growing up in the 80s, early 90s, one reaches adulthood. But yeah, but there's no internet. The access to knowledge is limited. I was privileged enough to grow up in a household with tons of books, but I read mainly fiction at that time. And so, what I would now regard as my worldviews really started shaping only in my 20s as I gradually got exposed in haphazard ways, and then began to seek out writings, and then the internet came and all of that. I'm very curious to know about how the way that you viewed the world gradually took shape, because there seems to be less of a haphazard element to it, in the sense that you're going to JNU, you're interacting with these teachers who are influential to you. Before that, you have the reading group where, at least, even if there may not be any one particular thinker who, appeals to you in that way, you at least get into the processes of questioning and discussion and how to read a book and all of that. So tell me a little bit about how you were formed in that way.
That's a very good point. Obviously, not just because of my mom and my parents' friends. So there was a kind of division in the family, or not division, but there was fiction was there, but also there was a world of politics. But, we still see this in India. The world of politics is not really well served in India by writing. Fiction is well served. You have a large number of Indian writers in all kinds of language and so on. Even Indian political commentary is, Indian reportage is very good, but I don't know, so I was interested always in political ideas because we used to have, I kid you not, 15 to 18 newspapers coming every day because, Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, and English, of course. But I was a consummate reader of newspapers. So I would say my kind of, even till date, I can't live without reading 2 or 3 newspapers a day. And in fact, I find the internet a bit, you haphazard, to use your word, because you don't get the full identity of a newspaper. You get bits and pieces. You read people. Now there is Substacks and the like. But the Indian Express was such an important source for my growth, I think, in terms of politics. A fiction I never took to, which was even till date, I read it, but I read it very selectively. And I don't know why that is. I was more animated by philosophical, abstract thinking or with political arguments. And so I, like everyone in, Chandigarh at that time was reading very unthinkingly Ayn Rand and, all of that. I read it and I was like, what is this? you know, and people were forming cults around it. And I was a bit like, it just left me like cold. Like I literally couldn't understand what, because it was so other, right? We were also growing up with pre-liberalization India. So you haven't really, you don't really kind of think about America in a big way. Right, America also comes into our lives much later. Let's be honest, so I'm just like, what is this author? Why are people banging on about her? Why are like they forming like all the so this was so I was saved in the sense that I was saved by my instincts in politics not to be swayed by that kind of writing. But you say that it was very systematic. It actually felt very directionless to me, because and also very, I always felt understimulated in Chandigarh, which and I was always like, my brother makes fun of me. I used to always say, let's go somewhere, let's do something. There was always like, I was always restless in Chandigarh. There was a kind of like dissatisfaction because it was either too smug, IAS, people are writing the IAS exam, or, there was a very kind of set paths, you are going to write IIM Ahmedabad exams, or, you're going to write it. It's an exam culture society for middle class people. But I was lucky because we had the kind of wider artistic journalistic milieu, which was, which almost seemed almost a bit dangerous in comparison to all the kind of well-regulated lives that people led in Chandigarh otherwise. So I was more influenced, I would think, by people rather than books in that period. And also I was less, and it was haphazard because I was thinking, oh my God, I should write the IAS exam, or my God, I should, become a journalist, or I should, but it was actually the intellectual teachings, the teachings of this, it was actually the JNU teachers who were so compelling, because I joined JNU and then I left it after 2 months because I thought, for various reasons, the campus had been very hostile to me and I didn't want to live there any longer. And so I, left it. But 18 months later, I sat the exam again and wrote in to kind of, to come in, because I felt the teachers were just, what they were teaching was, I could not forget it even after 18 months, though I'd only been there 2 months. So I think that teaching was formative. And yeah, what can I say? I mean, I haven't ever actually tried to give I think the academic discussion group was good because it exposed me to, it gave me experience to kind of how to kind of make arguments and how to think systematically.
Give me a sense of what your conception of yourself is at this point in time. Like, what do you want to do? So, you're in college in Chandigarh, you're in Punjab University, everybody around you is talking of marriage and, whatever else comes after. And you're kind of, a slightly different kind of person.
Bored.
Bored, yeah.
Bored.
Yeah. And then you go to,
I'm friendless and bored. I'm friendless and bored.
oh God, I'm already feeling so sorry for your past self. But so from there, how does your conception of self develop? Like, then you go to JNU. Are you ever at any point in time toying with the ideas of what your parents did, that either you want to be a journalist or you want to write, or?
Yeah, no. So yeah, for sure. So I, like most people, pre-liberalization people, I thought, I always thought I would write, but I didn't know that I would write in a formal way as an academic. I thought I would, as I said, in school, I always thought I would do journalism. But I think more at a deeper, unconscious level, I think what happened in Punjab and 2 decades of violence that, one witnessed through the 80s and 90s really made me I wouldn't say run away from politics, but gave me pause to think. I wanted to think more than I wanted to do. And yeah, so, there was, I think, at a fundamental unconscious level, I think there was this kind of lack of interest in politics emerging at this point. Not lack of interest, but a sense of distance emerging from what people would normally call the real world, because I think the inheritance had been quite, while had been quite, it is a violent inheritance, whether we directly suffer or not. And in our case, because of Indian Express, Chandigarh, all of that, it was a bit more, it was not that distant, that story. And I thought, oh, I should write this, since you do well in an exam, so people think, oh, you should write the civil service. And I actually thought, oh, I should become a civil servant. And, I never wanted to do the private sector. I didn't want to join the corporate world like my friends were joining. And I, within I didn't even kind of start a grammar. It was never going to happen, because I thought I cannot work for any government, because you then have to give up your voice. That's the thing about working for any government. It's not about A regime or B regime. Working for governments means that you lose your own voice and you lose your own. So then after that, it was clear that I would want to study more. I actually wanted to go to Chicago to study for my PhD with Barney Cohn, but I got lured into SOAS a year earlier, so that was that. And I only wanted to go to SOAS in London, and so and from then on, it was kind of then it's clear what I had to do. But like you, I didn't decide till, I don't know about you, but it was more in my 20s. And I remember even after my PhD, when I just started at Oxford for a postdoc, I was very hesitant about joining academia. And I really thought I should leave it. And then I think over the years, over the last decade, I would say my life has become much more enriched, because I have very consciously spent a lot of time in India and with India. So every spare time I have, of course, my parents were there and that also helped, but, it was also an engagement with its politics. I have really, as it were, made a significant effort towards being not just connected, but intermeshed with Indian stuff.
That kind of intrigues me when you say you very consciously over the last decade or so made an effort to, enmesh yourself in our politics and kind of understand that a bit better. Can you elaborate on your reasons for that? Like when you say very consciously, what made you feel that this was something that was kind of necessary for you to do?
So there were two reasons. Some were like kind of personal, which I don't want to get into. But the other thing is that, but they were related. I think the other side of it was that, when I came to England in the late 90s, it was a very vibrant society. It was, of course, people are very critical of Tony Blair, and rightly so for all of the stuff, but it was the opening up in the way that what we call globalization and the like. I'd been to England prior to that, or on a small visit, but it wasn't my first time in the late 90s, but it just looked completely different. And also, like, it was so open in terms of interactions and interest in the wider world. This was not my idea of England at all. And particularly London. I mean, Oxbridge and all that, I don't know, but London, central London, SOAS, and where I lived and my friends, I mean, it was over the top exciting time to be in Britain at that time. And it was Europe, it was Asia, it was America, all of it was like, happening there. Big art, the contemporary art scene was very big, And then, of course, you have 9/11 and it changes things. And then you have the war. And I mean, my friends and my intimates were all always interested or involved in British politics. So, so we would have lots of arguments and discussions. And of course, we all went to the march and all of this. But they were mainstream politics people, in the sense they either were in the Liberal Party or the Labour Party, or, even the odd Tory friend. conservative friend. But something happens in the sense, partly like the debates around the financial crisis don't really interest me. I mean, they're very important, but there's a divergence to Indian politics and British politics at that period, because 2008, if you recall, is a kind of golden moment for Indian politics, because you are beginning to have a rearmament of rights in India, right to education, right to information, all the things that the kind of buttressing of a rights-based regime, Manrega, there's a way in which you are getting growth, huge double-digit growth rates, the first UPA regime. And, I wasn't really a Congress, person, this is like, but when I saw all this happening from afar, and here there is kind of poverty, there's a way in which banks are collapsing. There is like, I just got really intrigued as to what had happened, because when I left in the mid to late 90s, I just thought, the BJP is going to be in India in power forever. You've had the nuclear blasts, you have a good growing economy, what's there to kind of for it to be a kind of endless ascendancy. And I think the UPA story interested me, that a way in which a kind of remaking of India was taking place. And I started teaching a lot about Indian political ideas. So it's around a decade ago, I started teaching on Indian politics very concertedly, but also on violence too. And I had phenomenal students in Cambridge, both graduate students and undergraduates. So it was a very live thing. And so then it meant, well, of course, you have to keep spending time there. You can't just keep reading commentary. So from then on, it just felt very organic and very natural. And then I had not really wanted to write in the press, but slowly I've now started doing it, and I quite enjoy it, in fact. And so, yeah, I mean, now I don't know what I'll do, but don't ask me that question. But so it's just I just think it's. And I mean, I still am very interested in Britain. It's not that, because I run a seminar series till the pandemic happened in Parliament here at the House of Lords on, connecting Indian and British interests and people and the like. But I felt like there was something at a kind of intellectual level, what was happening to Indian democracy is too compelling a story. And so, yeah.
So tell me a bit about Christopher Bailey also, because what kind of an influence was he on you? Because I know you worked with him. I've of course his books, Birth of the Modern World and Recovering Liberties, are both kind of classics, and I think you edited a book in which he wrote an introduction as well. And there is therefore this engagement that I see coming, an engagement that he had with the intellectual history of India, which in a sense you're continuing, and which Violent Fraternity is therefore a successor to that.
Yeah, okay. So, I worked with Chris. I mean, he was, of course, teaching at Cambridge and the like. And so I really met him after I was in Oxford, and also when I with postdoc, but also when I was in America. And really, this was kind of a conversation that started about the future of Indian history writing. And that really is at the, because, in the mid to late 2000s, so coming up to about 2010, when I edited the book on intellectual history of India, where he writes an afterword, but also an essay, but a large number of other historians contributed to it. It was really an opening to say, well, we need a new conversation on Indian history, because the debates. So I really don't belong to the so-called Cambridge School of Indian History, nor am I a Bailey student. There is very little, you could say, methodological or empirical commonality in my project and his, right? But what there was a kind of commonality, or was the idea that actually what India really needs is an intellectual history, an accounting of its own political ideas. And because, so in that sense, that there was Faisal in Oxford, who was a close collaborator of mine. So there were a bunch of us who were very motivated. We didn't want to have a school or anything shudder the thought, because that would not. I really think people should be individual authors, and they should do their own thing. So yeah, but there was a kind of common concern that Indian history had kind of saturated into a kind of very strange set of debates, particularly around 10, 15 years ago, where these debates were about power and knowledge on the one side, or they were very reductive, instrumental readings of Indian politics. Interest groups, or and I think I was always, having grown up in India, been so politicized in India in my own way. I always saw, like, whether even a figure like Bhindranwale, who was such a big figure in my childhood, these are people animated by ideas. They don't just want power. It's so I wanted to kind of return to some of my most long held beliefs about Indian life, that India is not a sum total of its economy or its society. It has always had innovation of ideas and thoughts in it, and somehow historians were not interested in it. Bailey was interested always in his history writing is different from mine, because he was interested in two things. One, he was interested in looking at Indian social change as the driver of, if I can say, British Empire or modern politics and so on. So he was interested in what Indian merchants were doing, what Indian groups were doing, what were the rising groups, how are they kind of, navigating the world. That kind of social history has not been, while I studied it, I certainly can teach it, I can certainly supervise on it. It's not the kind of history I wish to write. But I suppose, as I said, yeah, the accounting for ideas is what that's the intellectual project I had commonality with Bailey. On world history and global history, of which he was the singular author, really, he kind of, Birth of the Modern World is a classic and the like. I think it's a superb book, but I think I'd like to debate with the book, because, to me, India doesn't offer convergence. India offers, which is what I try and show in my book, India offers competing diversity of not ideas, and not a kind of convergence to a modern project. But having said that, he was a very Catholic figure in terms of, his interests and the kinds of histories he was able to mentor, help, and the like.
I'm also interested in, something you've said before about how you believe that political ideas have causative value, that they actually cause social change. And so, a two-part question, and the second part of it deals with that, and I'll ask you to elaborate on that. But the first part is that it also seems to me that then one of your approaches towards understanding the political ideas of individuals is through their actions as well. That in many cases, somebody, a political philosopher, therefore, who you're looking at, may not need to have written a book of political philosophy or a treatise, but you can work out from their actions and their campaigns and so on and so forth, and something cogent emerges from there, and you can deduce what the political ideas are from there, and therefore you can look at the impact of those ideas on society and say that, hey, when we are talking about ideas, we're not just looking back on the past and in hindsight, figuring out patterns and all of that, but that they are strong, cogent, coherent ideas at the time that are driving those individuals and which are changing society. So, have I stated that kind of correctly? And, can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I couldn't have said it better. But so I think this is part of the reason. So the thing is, in the West, certainly, there's this idea of decoloniality. Like, we need to know more about the non-West. How do they think? There's this kind of great clamor at the moment for it. And then in India, you have the opposite, a kind of heightened nativism, chauvinism, bordering on chauvinism, that, even nuclear power existed in the Vedic age, like you can, you've done it all, so we are just repeating history as a farce, it seems, if we've even, so, it's not clear, like, if we've already been through everything, what is going on then, but I was, So as I said, Indian history is a very robust tradition. It has had a huge impact on the writing of other histories. People, whether you do European history or, Latin American history, Indian historians have had a huge impact on the profession. And that's not, I'm talking about my predecessors, generations, like whether it's subaltern studies, whether it's Bailey, whether it's, a Marxist, even like, say, someone like Sumit Sarkar and Tanika Sarkar, these people have had a kind of global kind of significance which goes beyond the study of India. And yet, and so that's why India is a very instructive place for reading the world through, because its scale, its debates offer a miniature form of global debates. So that's the kind of, but most historians have only looked at social economic processes or mobilizations into India, right? So when I was thinking, like, India is one of the most political societies in the world. It's the largest republic. It's the most diverse democracy. It's got the largest affirmative action program in the world. Surely these cannot be understood simply down to some sort of economic bargaining or just looking at how people got mobilized around, the social history, as it were, of a movement which kind of creates a change. So where do you look for ideas? And as you rightly say, and if you look at the parallel examples in world history, French Revolution comes to mind, even the American Revolution, but also the English Civil Wars, Hilary Mantel. I mean, I don't know how many people are reading her. I mean, that's the era of the Civil Wars, and that's also the birth of modern politics in this country and in Britain. So there, in all these contexts, the figure of the philosopher has had a role. You can say, Voltaire and Rousseau, we can debate, did Voltaire really affect this? Or India doesn't present us with that problem. India presents us with the opposite problem, which is that it has politically innovated without a doubt. So the people have typically looked at the constitution for that innovation. But that's actually a miss for the reasons you yourself spelled out earlier. It's not exactly representative of India's political innovation. But so where do you start? And I was, this was a question that I had, been thinking about. And initially I thought, text. So which is why I thought, let's do a book on the Gita. Why is everyone writing on the Gita? And then I kind of thought that actually the job is the opposite for India, that historians and theorists have to make thinkers out of these actors, because we need to give them their conceptual space, their conceptual due, if I can use their word, their reflective agency, because they really thought about all these things. And it's, so we only see them as actors and we think, we know what they may say about caste or conversion or partition. But actually, when you read them, that's not the case at all. We don't know them because, they are writing in the full awareness of liberalism, Marxism, and, and they don't produce a khichdi. They don't produce a kind of salad. They produce completely new ideas out of it, And so for me, I wanted to capture that. And some of those ideas are very uncomfortable. And most starkly, you see that in Patel. Patel doesn't write at all. Like Jinnah, like his adversary, very little next to no writings, lots of speeches, but a huge influence on Indian life. So how do you so the challenge then was to kind of see their action as thought and then write it up as a kind of, as I said, to give it a kind of conceptual heft rather than always seeing, they are going out there and working, intervening, this, that. But so, well, hopefully, it has had some, it is also written, it's written for India, of course, but it's also written to destabilize the canon of political thought, which is so heavily policed in the West. That, we all think that, the West produced political ideas. And so it's also destabilizing that.
And in the case of someone like Gandhi, what kind of strikes me, and what I've always thought about, I mean, I like to say people contain multitudes, borrowing from Whitman's famous poem, and obviously Gandhi is a classic example of that. You go through any of his 100 volumes, it's like mind-boggling, and he can be anything you want him to be. So, if Fazal says he's an anarchist, you can find support for that. One of my friends keeps arguing he's the first classical liberal. I guess you can find support for that. You can find support for anything, right? So, and I'm skeptical of any of those readings, kind of, but that's in Gandhi's case. Now, the thing is, when you sort of try to come at all of these different figures and figure out that, okay, if I am to assume that their actions are a reflection of their political ideas, and if I am to deduce from their actions that these then are their political ideas, how much do you have to warn yourself against a tendency to perhaps read something into read something which isn't there, or to overinterpret, or just the urge to simplification, which I guess every historian has to watch out for?
Thank you. That's a very good question, which is partly why, as I said, to go back to it, like I really didn't want to pigeonhole them to any ideology. I didn't want them to be called, I have barely used the word liberal for anyone. They all, I'm more interested, therefore, in, as I say, the grammar, the basic toolkit of politics. What is sovereignty? What is violence? What is it to mean to live with each other? What is the Hindu-Muslim question? Why is partition should not be seen as partition violence, but civil war? So I'm interested at the very kind of basic foundational level, because if you were to see them as liberal, then you would either be celebrating a tradition at the cost of another, or you would be boxing these figures in in a way which would not be helpful or illuminating. And then you end up with that debate, which we constantly have, is so and so a Hindu nationalist or is he not? Is so and so a liberal or not? And I was not interested in categorizing, but really seeing the innovation on, say, as I said, on questions of violence, on questions of political agency, on statecraft, on the Hindu-Muslim question. I was interested in those concrete problems and concrete concepts. And I hope I haven't overread. One of the joys of being a historian, or frustrations of being a historian, is that you can't really say things without evidence. So, so I had to sort of stick to the script, because I would have loved to have said, well, Patel is Hindutva plus plus. And, it would have made my life really easy. But, he's a bit more complicated than that, so that's the thing, that these figures themselves are also defying easy categorization. Like, would you call Nehru a socialist? I don't know. I would find it quite hard. Of course, though he's part of a socialist tradition on the economy. So it's very hard to group these figures. And I think that's why India is also produces a kind of very robust, competitive democracy, because there are many political ideas from the get-go written into its birthing, into its founding.
What an interesting part of that whole narrative of Tilak filing the case against Shirol's book Indian Unrest and so on, is this little anecdote which you have about, not an anecdote but a little sort of something that that Indian Unrest focused on, which was a performance of the Marathi play Kichakwad, or the killing of Kichak. I hope I'm pronouncing it properly. And
Yes.
yeah, and I'll quickly for the listeners kind of relate what that happened. What the play is really about, the killing of Kichak, is about how the Pandavas, in their last year of exile, they had to be anonymous somewhere. They had to go somewhere where they couldn't be found, and they couldn't be uncovered. If they were uncovered, they would have lost the bet. So they went to this particular kingdom called Viratnagar, where they were kind of posing as sort of servants or whatever, and a gentleman named Kichak, the commander-in-chief of the kingdom of Virat and an ally of Duryodhan. As it happened, he saw Draupadi and he was charmed by her and all of that. And then he told Yudhishthir, okay, send her to my harem. And now Yudhishthir has the dilemma that either he, sullies his wife's dishonor by sending her, because, of course, in our epics, women are the property of men, or he, gets busted and, he says who he is and he refuses and he gets completely busted. And eventually, what happens is that Bhim steps into the picture and Bhim poses as a statue of a god. And just when Kichak is about to, get it on with Draupadi, he kills Kichak. And according to Shirol, when he writes about this play, this play is a seditious play, according to him, because everything in it is an allegory. That Kichaka is basically Lord Curzon, and Draupadi is India, and Yudhishthir is the moderate, and Bhima is the extremist party, right? And I was fascinated by this, and fascinated by how something in culture is being sort of depicted in this way. Now, it also strikes me that when we speak about all of these figures, Patel, Savarkar, Nehru, Gandhi, all of these, what is at one level important is what you've tried to do to figure out their ideas from their actions and to get to the truth of what they are. But equally important, as in Kichak's place, is what they are seen as. Like Patel may not have left much writing behind, but what he is seen as today is relevant, and that is constantly evolving, and he is part of the narrative battles. Ditto with Savarkar, and in a sense you could argue there are two Savarkars, pre 1910 and before. The Savarkar who wrote the history of the 1857 mutiny is almost, seems to me, a completely different person from the person who wrote Hindutva, because his years in prison and all of that had kind of changed him. But what is less important to me is these people themselves. To me, that's a historical curiosity. What were they actually like? But what is more relevant in modern times, and what is a live political question, is how are they perceived? So therefore, how the notion of Patel, the notion of Savarkar, the notion of Gandhi, how those kind of mutate through the ages and becomes divorced from whatever they were. So what are sort of your thoughts on this? Because anything, any history of Patel, any understanding of Patel, does it have to take this into account, or can it stop at the moment he dies?
No, no, it doesn't. And I think, thank you, because I think the thing is that there are two reasons why these figures are so inexhaustible at the moment. One, of course, because the very political settlement of 1947-50 of India is being challenged and is being remade, and as a result we are all visiting those founding moments in our own light, in the light of our own politics, and parties are doing the same, right? So that's a kind of overall context in it. But there's a deeper context to what you're suggesting, and which I would agree with instinctively, which is that these figures are they're inexhaustible. It's a bit like Marx. Every generation will read their own Marx. They will interpret him in their own, in the light of their own experience. And I think that's what's happening with, this is why I'm calling them as founding figures, because they have that inexhaustible role. Finally, when you say that in elections and all, they're also rolled out, and their word, their name is like an invocation. It distills as it conveys the power of something, power of a particular idea. So, sure, Patel will be remade. Each generation will discover their own Patel, as it were. Gandhi's, reputation is going up and down, and Ambedkar's is up, and all those things are indicators, in fact, of our democratic present. So it's not that they are frozen in the archives of life, of time. Far from it. They are far too alive. They are the ones who are haunting and animating, and that's why they cannot be elided, dismissed, or just be. And that's why they're so foundational. That's why they are like father figurations, if I've used a particularly deliberately patriarchal term, because the fraternal argument and even the father figuration of the political in India is intensely masculine. So it will be interesting to think about women and gender more. That would be the challenge of my own work. How does it configure it? Because women are almost fully excluded, or because the default figure is the figure of the man in these discourses. There is no getting away from it. Gandhi is the only philosopher a political philosopher, thinker, who will expend a great deal of energy, good or bad, on the women's question in this way. So, the new challenge, at least for the next coming, if I were to write a sequel to this book, or to write a kind of later period, the question would be of women and gender, and how to even think about so today's burning question, I wrote it like, not burning question, but it's a question of certainly contemporary politics. Can women actually become a vote bank in India? To ask the kind of that question, if everything is a vote bank, and can women become a vote bank? And if they haven't, what does it tell us? And so, yeah, I mean, the history of India's democracy is its own book to be written, and it's particularly its political languages, but it cannot be divorced from these guys, because they are the foundational figures who are also still on the scene. It's not like they've left the scene. Patel is very much here, and Gandhi's very much here. They're just here. They're like, yeah. So
Yeah, Patel is very much here, and a statue as well. Plot for a sort of dystopian novel, I guess. A statue of Patel should one day start walking towards Delhi. That would be interesting. Like
I know that would be
stomp, stomp,
amazing.
stomp, stomp. Yeah, that would be fun. And what you mentioned about women as vote bank, I had the data journalist Rukmini S on my show talking about her excellent
Yes.
book, and she's examined that question at length. And her conclusion is, of course, they're not a vote bank anywhere, because of the simple reason that women contain multitudes. They have diverse interests, and at some level it seems to me to be an opportunity lost, because the fact of the matter is that for 70 something years women have really been second class citizens in India. So
that's what my point is, that there is a potential to make them a vote bank. Of course, women in here, multiple identities, whether it's for religious purposes, whether it's of caste purposes, of family, of role, of rank, all of those things, right? But precisely since things have been so utterly bad for them, it could mean that they could be the true inheritors now of but I think it would not be possible. That's why I think there's so much hesitancy in India, where it's so easy to legislate. Every day there's a new law. Whether you can do anything about it is different. But even the hesitancy to legislate on reservation for women tells you both the impossibility, but also the potentiality of the female vote bank. So I would not fundamentally agree. I would not give up on it as a vote bank just yet.
I think maybe it is a positive statement and not a normative one. As we said earlier, change can happen. Just as Amit Shah united the Hindu vote, maybe you can come and enter politics and, animate this. Yeah. Enough academics, yeah. What is this? Change the world. Come on. Yeah. So, but kind of getting back to the combination of the world of politicians and writers, one interesting point that you made is that in those early years, like after the partition of Bengal and kind of, Tagore and Aurobindo go their different ways, you have three fascinating books come out, which are both indicative of the changing tide, as it were. And one of them is, Tilak's narration of the Bhagavad Gita. One is Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, and one is Savarkar's book on the 1857 mutiny. Tell me why you kind of lump these two together as sort of creatures of the time, and what they indicate, and what is the importance of these books.
So thank you. I'd kind of forgotten about our book. We are talking about contemporary Indian politics. You've dragged me back. So yeah, the Bhagavad Gita is a monumental commentary by him after, as I said, it breaks apart the kind of liberal contractualism but also the Congress has split for the first time in its history over the liberals and moderates, as you described in the Kichak Vad play, and it's a debate between Gokhale and Tilak, and over means of political action. Coming out of that moment, he then produces, as I said, the question of the Gita, the question of war, and The book is a sellout success, and I wanted to say, when you were speaking about Kichak Vad, one of the reasons that epics, particularly the parables from the Mahabharata, become such a potent site for conveying political messages. So, censorship is oppressive in India in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. So the work of politics is really policed. Bizarrely, or as a result, the realm of religion is not policed by the imperial surveillance structure, which allows religion a fair degree of autonomy in relative to the political sphere, which is why these ideas are conveyed also through this register. Quite apart from them being popular and the like, but there's a kind of there's a space to do it, which is not there in the conventional political sphere as we understand. Anyway, that was just a kind of way to say that that's why there is this way in which this form of political communication takes place. But the failure of Swadeshi, you have this. But, Savarkar is in London in that period. In fact, he's in the early 1900s. He is sitting in Hampstead, which, in one of the foremost secret societies of that period. Shyamji Krishna Varma was a patron of these secret societies. And Abhinav Bharat, is his secret society is sitting in London, where Madan Lal Dhingra is also a member, and who would then shoot Curzon Wiley, and that's the beginning of kind of a more international stage for this politics. And Savarkar is explicitly involved in writing the history of the Indian Mutiny by using the same sources that British imperial historians had used. So the date itself is significant, 1907, because Kyrle and all these people are also pretty worried because it's the 50th anniversary of the Indian Mutiny. And Savarkar wants to write a book precisely as an assessment by an Indian through those very imperial records of the same thing. So his account is radical, but it's not as radical as we would think. I mean, there is space for Muslims, but it's not like, so there is some continuity. There's a continuity in Savarkar's oeuvre, because he will always give war a very significant role as a driver in history. War and violence mean a lot, but also another theme that I developed, secrecy. Secrecy would matter to him, and which is why the RSS would also initially would form like a secret society, which I write about. So these are all Savarkar's, and so I think these are formative because they're all reacting to that 50th year moment. Gandhi is reacting actually to Hind Swaraj to these figures he has encountered in Shyamji Krishna Varma's house in India House in Hampstead. Anthony Parel, who has written the kind of, the kind of Cambridge edition of Hind Swaraj, he's actually saying that the book is addressed to Savarkar. And so you have this kind of, so there's a way in which that liberal story has come to an end. Imperial liberal story in Indian mindset has come to an end. And people are looking for new ideas in the aftermath of the Swadeshi, but also in the 50th year of the Indian Mutiny. And so it's not a coincidence that these three books are written within months of each other. Of course, both Savarkar's book and Hind Swaraj would be banned, but precisely because I said the work of religion would be allowed a degree of freedom under censorship, the Gita sells out. It has multiple editions within 2 years and translated in all sorts of languages. Even a pocket book is created. So it's a kind of a big book. It's a modular book for that. And it sets the terrain for several decades till Ambedkar comes and does something else with this landscape.
What I also found interesting was you talk about how Tilak turned away from liberalism, in the sense he had nothing to do with liberalism or freedom as something to aspire to anymore, but he created what, in your words, is a new political theology. So, I found this phrasing really interesting. Later, you also sort of refer to Schmidt when you say, as the controversial legal and political theorist Carl Schmitt famously stated, all modern political ideas, and ideas of the state in particular, are in effect secularized theological concepts. So I've explained this.
Okay, so I like the word political theology a lot. I prefer it to secularism because a bit like Gandhi, I do think that you can't separate a human being's religion from their politics. You can't really. It's an impossible demand. And so Schmidt shows in his work, and actually this has now become very important again for all sorts of people, like legal theorists like Paul Kahn, but like all sorts of people, to kind of say, well, actually, so Schmidt actually says that modern political concepts in the West are really, they're basically rationalized version or a hidden version or another version of theological, particularly Judeo-Christian theological concepts. Yeah. And so, therefore, the word that we should be using is political theology rather than secularization or any of that. Now, this is something I think is fascinating because Tilak is normally understood to be someone who introduced religion into the realm of politics in India, but if you start by saying that these are not separate spheres, then that argument is a non-starter. But also, as I was explaining about the relative degrees of freedom and unfreedom between these two places, so what Tilak is therefore trying to do is really trying to convey politics, as I said, through a kind of the epic, the tradition, epic tradition, rather than a mythological epic tradition in India. And the problem for actually India is the opposite, that we don't have enough of a veil on religion, it would seem. Yeah, we would see that there's too much religion everywhere in our politics. And this is what frustrates Indian secularists. Yeah. And so I'm interested in the interplay, the open interplay between religion and politics, rather than seeking its separation or policing it. And so, which is why I could go and look at the Gita as a result, as the text. And that's a text, or the fact that I could even think of Iqbal's philosophical history of Islam as a way of discovering a new republican sentiment in Islam, which would be consequential. But if you were to just see this as a pathology, then you will not, it would not, these would, we will not have I would not be able to write my book, is what I'm saying. And so I think, yeah, so I'm interested in the open interplay between religion and politics rather than its policing, and because that's what history has shown us. And what then the law can do about it is a different order of questions, which I have not addressed in this book. But in the sense, you could say that part of the problem of the Indian Constitution is its default Hindu-ness as well. So though we are accustomed to debates around the Uniform Civil Code and, but history has already told us in the 50s that what was hardest to reform was the Hindu Code Bill, that it was actually Ambedkar lost his political career to that. He didn't lose his political career to some other problem. He lost it to reforming the Hindu Code Bill. And it only takes up to 2005 for women to inherit in India, So, those debates, the question of how do you triangulate religion, politics, and the law, I think those debates need to take place in India, and they will take place because UCC is forcing that discussion, But because we've always thought of it that, okay, religion and law, it probably just belongs to Muslims. Yeah. But that's not the case. So I was interested in, so that's how I came to a political theological understanding of what Tilak is doing, or what even But it's interesting that Hindutva would depart from this way of thinking because Savarkar is not interested in religion. Yeah, Savarkar is interested in Hindu-ness. He's an atheist. He's interested in, a particular way of. So his books don't have this kind of epic quality. They don't have this kind of, in fact, people think, whether it's the various mandirs or whatever, there's some sacred landscape, the way people tend to think about it. But that's not Savarkar at all. In fact, the whole idea is not about sacrality or religion or even theology. It's a kind of pure, simple political Hindu-ness, which is a category of political mastery. It is not a category of religious realization of power.
So I'm going to go back to the early frame that you mentioned in your book, which is that of the hedgehog, which was Schopenhauer's hedgehog, and then Freud took it over and brought it up and fed it and nurtured it, and then Freud handed it over to you. In my mind, that's kind of how it's going. so,
Thank you.
so so now, what, through this beautiful metaphor, what you kind of postulate is that, the attention of our early freedom fighters shifted from, the foreigner, which is the Britisher, from the colonial force, whether they took it for granted or whether they assumed that force would be gone at some point, to each other. And there was sort of this fraternal mingling, and the one core consideration there was violence, right? And I find the metaphor very beautiful. Hedgehogs coming close together, then prickling each other, pushing apart, and all of that. So to take that forward, can you, talk about how, from those decades, from the failure of our resistance to the partition of Bengal up until independence, what are the various ways in which the hedgehogs came together, pushed away, came together, pushed away? And what do I can't, that's such a nice image. So thank you for using that
Oh,
metaphor.
thank you. Thank you.
So,
Wonderful.
yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll be try and do it quickly because I think I'm giving very long answers. So one of the ways to think about it would be that these hedgehogs, or there's a big coalition after the Swadeshi movement in the Gadar movement, which is international, where there's even a declaration of government of India in Kabul, where actually Muslims do a hijrat. Large number of Muslims leave India in Kabul only to be then sent back and then have a huge crackdown. So you have moments of coming together, and I think that the question of the hedgehog question is most, how do I put it, most systematically and most sustained way really discussed by Gandhi and Ambedkar and their fight, which I've elaborated on whether we can live together, what are the conditions of living together, the question of extremacy, what might be the right. So for Gandhi, it's an extremacy. For Ambedkar, it is a kind of recognition that actually there is a huge amount of civil war. The reasons these hedgehogs are apart, these hedgehogs might be apart, but they're apart as in the castes, because this is a chasm of violence that has ensured that they are separate. This is not they're separate because they are just hurting each other because of their intimacy. He's saying there is no intimacy between castes, and and that lack of intimacy is produced by violence, by a civil war in Indian history, and which is repeated now. He uses a word, that the Nazis could learn from the Hindus. He says in his books, because they don't even have to display their violence now to have control over it. So you have this story, this question of closeness, violence, intimacy, fraternity, and sovereignty, which is the life and death question. Who controls the state? Who controls the power of life over others? That is what sovereign power is. And for that, the answer always also then Ambedkar steers away from the hands of, for want of a better word, from Gandhi's death politics, individual death politics, and, more about moving it towards republican order, like, as I said, the democratic formation. But I think the moment of the real head comes to it in the partition violence. And there, I think Patel's owning of this idea that this is a fratricide, it is a civil war, allows him to kind of reorder that violence into a kind of new Republican form, which is to say that this violence, to me, I revise the study of partition violence as simply something that history does to people, because I'm very critical of, well, let's use a less negative word. I'm very surprised that people think that in this narration of partition violence, everyone is a victim. Yeah, no one has perpetrated that violence. How is that possible? 1 million people died. So that's why I was interested in seeing its political nature. So it was seen to be a guilt-free violence on the one side, and on another side, it was seen to be something that history extracted out of people, the price of history, or it was seen as a blame game, Jinnah, Patel, Nehru, the British, a kind of revolving game. And actually, when you read about it, you see how actually it worked, where the crowd, much like lynch mobs today, acquire the status of semi-sovereigns, because they can hide their anonymous agency. They're kind of, it's not like a homicide or a murder where, you can, ultimately get a figure culpable, precisely the crowd allows you to kind of hide in yourself. But at the same time, it becomes a semi-sovereign because it kills without impunity. It kills, it just kills. And there's a particular structure to partition violence, which I explain, that takes place, and that form is repeated everywhere. And really, partition violence is the form of violence from which an externality is produced out of an intimacy. How to make something which is internal to you, intimate to you, how to make it not foreign, but external. And that's why it is so violent. That is precisely why it is so violent, because it has to expunge, externalize something which is so deeply intimate, known, implicated. And yeah, so I would see that story as that, and as a kind of, when the hedgehogs really, have a kind of, huge kind of bust up, and then there is, yeah.
And these hedgehogs are still dancing today, right? So, my question therefore is that we read your book, gives us another lens through which to look at our history and to look at these figures and so on and so forth. And you've described the jostling of the hedgehogs really well just now when you, brought us all the way up to partition. But these jostlings are happening today. We still have these hedgehogs, as it were. And I'm wary of using the word extremacy because all these pictures will come into my head. What have you done? But so, when we look at modern times, and you have also spoken about how you make it a point to come to India to also engage with what is happening around you and so on and so forth. What are the lessons we can learn in two different ways? One, as just concerned citizens who are looking around us and seeing what is happening. From the prism that you build of looking at Indian history, how can we see present times better? That's question number one. And question number two is that as actors in this drama, in whatever limited roles we have as citizens, or some people maybe public intellectuals and so on, what are the interventions that are possible? What can be done?
No, thank you. Tough questions. So, one, I'll start with a very pessimistic note, which is that the Constitution will not save us. And this is the problem, and that it's actually, which is why, I've been very critical of books that have celebrated the Indian Constitution. Not because it's not worth celebrating as a document, it is, but it no longer is now, it's not capable, it has not, you can fetishize it as you did, in the CAA and all of that, protests and so on. But there is something going on with Indian democracy, which is, it feels almost as if democracy and India's constitution are in parallel. And they are not the same thing at all. So, for one, I would say that one can't read the story of India's democracy through its constitution, which is a habit our public intellectuals have, our scholars have, and certainly our activists have. And, it's more like you can own the Constitution, you can fight over the ownership of the Constitution, but the Constitution in itself is not going to resolve the situation. Yeah, that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think that there's been a huge innovation in the theory and practice of violence in the last 10 years. I would, since sort of 2014. Okay, let's start with the 2000s. Actually, since Gujarat, but also, so it was interesting that the so-called weak government of Manmohan Singh saw very few riots in India. It was a peaceful decade, maybe a decade of corruption, but not a decade of riots, violence, insurgencies, and counterinsurgencies that, we associated certainly with earlier Congress eras of the 70s and 80s. But so it was a new kind of UPA, new kind of Congress in the 2000s, which is interesting, which has not been written about, to be honest. So that requires some thinking about. But post that, violence has taken a different form in the sense that lynch mobs are not this. So we've seen fewer riots, but many more lynch mobbings. And that, in a way, is almost a different kind of theory of violence because it cuts across. I mean, it just kind of breaks the basic compact between the subject and the state, between the citizen and the state, which is to say, 101, just kind of politics 101 lesson that, we as individuals live under a state. Why? We give a bit of our individual freedom. We are not going to be in a state of nature and just kind of mightest is, is the strongest, is kind of brute force or any of that. Because yes, we will flourish and also we will get some security. The idea is that, there is a kind of physical security in giving up a little bit of our natural rights of whatever they may be. Now, something like lynch mobs is not like a riot, which is a collective act of, it's a collective act of many things. Lynch mobs, in a way, are going into the basic compact between you individual, and the state, and breaking it by actually entering your home, as happened with Akhlaq. The first lynch mobbing is actually breaching. It's not taking place in the street. And then someone coming to your house. They've come straight to your house. And so it means there's a different kind of, it means different things for Indian democracy is what I'm saying. And I mean, I think the difficulty for me is to ask the question whether a politics of conviction is possible in India. So the question to ask would be like, is there a politics of conviction possible in India, or is conviction now totally exhausted by Hindutva? Right? So you have Hindutva politics, which is highly ideological. You believe in A, B, C. You have X, Y, Z things to hate, A, B, C things to love. It's a pretty clear project. Yeah. And then you have, as it were, caste parties, where people are like, okay, many, OBC groups, Dalit groups, I mean, great, but there is no politics of conviction. Where is the space for a politics of conviction? That's what I'm interested in. And where will it come from? And I think that is now a challenge for something like the Congress, because a Congress story has dissipated in the last 40, 50 years, precisely because of multi-party democracy. So the founding figures could contain a large number of these political projects under a broad tent in the 50s, in the 60s, precisely because the work of nation building and something else took precedence. But also there was less democratic competition. Now there is much more democratic competition. But at the same time, there is also a kind of exclusionary violence associated with the project of Hindu nationalism, which has a huge amount of social mandate. You can't say that this is just a bunch of thugs coming and doing it. A lot of people are backing it. And I just wanted to show in my book that actually these figures have thought about all these problems, that they had actually navigated the question of violence and politics more than we had given credit to them, because we thought India's story of freedom was primarily nonviolent.
My pessimistic sense would be that as things stand today, there is simply no politics of conviction in India today. Maybe it might emerge, who knows? And I want to also double down on what you said, and I agree with totally. And I know many people disagree with us on this. That I agree that the Constitution will not save us, and I give a couple of reasons for this. One is that the Constitution is completely irrelevant to society and what's happening around us. And a classic example of this is this hijab controversy, where I think we often kind of get diverted into either focusing on the aspect of is hijab good or bad, which to me is not relevant to this at all. And the other question is, are constitutional rights to be should be protected, which is also not relevant to this at all. I think the central issue here is the hate for Muslims. That is a central issue here. That is the force that is popping up at different parts of our society all of the time, and that's what we need to counter, and the Constitution will not help us. And one reason is the Constitution is irrelevant to society, and the second reason is the Constitution is not what many of us think it is. The Constitution, like there's this famous cartoon where somebody goes to the Parliament bookstore and says, can I have a copy of the Constitution? And the person replies, oh, we sorry sir, we only stock books, not periodicals. That it has been defaced so often, starting from the time of Nehru, that it no longer is what it once was, which is why Ambedkar said, I would like to burn it. And it does not protect any of our rights, including our right to free speech or to dissent. I mean, it was Nehru who, brought the sedition law back after the court struck it down as unconstitutional. So, I share your pessimism of the Constitution there. You have any thoughts to add to that, or shall I move on to my final couple of questions?
No, please move.
So, couple of questions right at the end, and one is what used to be the last question I would ask all my guests, but I stopped asking because nobody was hopeful anymore. But since I warned you about it, I might as well ask you that, from a historian's perspective, like it is possible for somebody like me who may not study history so deeply to sit around here and to look at the current times and be extremely negative, or for someone else who believes in the political project that is happening to, feel the opposite way, right? But you have a historian sweep of history where, you've seen decades and centuries pass by in a flash in your in your mind's eye. So if you are to say think of India 15 years from now, like 2037, what's a best case scenario and what's a worst case scenario from there? What would you hope for, and what would you be fearful of?
So I would be fearful of a full-on Hindu state, only because India is too diverse, and it would require not so much control of violence, but the deployment of violence to produce it. And so that project to me is not simply a majoritarian project of democracy, but a project of a certain form of politics of violence, which Gandhi knew so well. And it's not coincidental that it's really his assassination which puts an end to the civil war of partition. So, people had been killing and killing and killing for, months. If you start with 46 and direct action dates, it's almost, a year and a half, two almost to it. So my worry would be the realization of the Hindu state as through a kind of both the control, the dispersal of violence, the displacement of violence through the deployment of violence. And so that would be, I think, a bad thing for India, because India is also very diverse. It will not, even if that fantasy came to be true, it would require kind of violence that is unprecedented in human history. It's not simply to India, it would be unprecedented in human history, because you know the numbers of Indians involved, the number of Muslims, number of Dalits, it's a big, big society. So what would I be hopeful of? What would I be hopeful of is, a politics of conviction that actually, let's be honest and say, there are two ideas of India. Yeah. So let's have two national parties. Really, like a fight between two major ideas. At the moment, we don't have that. Our party structure is this history of Indian party structure has unfolded, even with Indira Gandhi's and the like, even with, Nehru even starting, you had, as it were, one national party, and then you had regional federated parties that can come as a front, and now the role has reversed because you have the BJP as a national political force and you have regional parties. But can we actually have a party politics which is bipartisan, two major national parties, if there are really two ideas of India, which I think there are, and of course the regional parties should also have to have them. I'm not saying it should be either or. The regional parties should also exist. That's not what I'm saying. So I'm interested in a kind of politics of conviction to see whether there'll be two national parties in India. And if there are, then there is hope. Then there is real hope, because then you can have a contestation, like with Trump, after 4 years, he left, he had to go, But otherwise, I also think some of the chauvinism cringe has to go in India. It's too so people go from one extreme to another. Everything has happened, as I said, nuclear weapons in the Vedic age. So like, what are we doing now, right? So why bother? Like, we are just declining in that case, right? We're just a declining civilization if, we've had all of this, So we have that, or we are always like a kind of superior isolationism. Like, we don't care about the West, yet we want its approval all the time. And you're seeing that a lot at the moment in India, whether it's its foreign policy, whether it's, So anyway, it's an interesting time because China, there are many things happening that by the time, in 15 years' time, if I'm alive, if, we should have this conversation again, because, I think the world map is going to look very different. The world political order map is going to look very different.
That's fascinating, and that's a promise. I will hold you to that. 15 years later, if both of us are still around, we'll definitely have a conversation. And so I want to kind of then end with a final question for all my guests, which is that I'd like you to recommend for my listeners and for me, books or films or music that you absolutely love and you'd like to share with the world. It need not necessarily be related to your field of study, or it could be no boundaries at all. But what would you take with you to a desert island? Like, what has given you real joy and knowledge and illumination in your life?
So I think Freud has been an abiding interest of mine, and in fact, it's the first piece of book, actually a full book I read cover to cover as a teenager in Chandigarh. And so remains and he's a very good writer, even though he's been sort of not always been helped by good translators. I think there's something very literary about his writing, because it's about human experience, emotions, but also big things like political leadership and God even. So I really enjoy him. And in terms of, I'm somewhat ashamed to say that I'm not a huge fiction reader, given that my mother was a fiction, wrote fiction. And I don't know whether it's my resistance to my mother, because I'm a very avid reader of newspapers, magazines, nonfiction. I consume like as if you're watching a film or something. So I think, so having said that, there's a kind of brilliant memoir written by a South Asian woman who recently died, Sara Soleri. Her memoir is called Meatless Days, and it's about living in Lahore during Ramzan, but also about a constricted kind of life, but which leads to imagination, and it's very witty. And it's written by a woman. There are very few memoirs which were, which were kind of resonant, given that I grew up in a kind of Punjab and Chandigarh, which was what we call locked down today. But, it was kind of, it was very restricted. You couldn't really do much. There wasn't much of a social life to be had. And her book really spoke to me. And then I discovered when I went to JNU that she was actually a very eminent academic. Today, this is pre-internet days, so you couldn't really Google search anyone. So, in a way, there was a kind of mystery to a writer in some ways. And I enjoyed finding out that she was a very brilliant academic as well. And then, of course, I love I absolutely love Rohinton Mistri's books, and again, very much on politics of India, but also how personally, things. So for an earlier generation, or for some people, Rushdie has been such a huge impact, and I think there was something to his writing in a way that it predated or prefigured what historians would do later with partition, for instance, right? I mean, the Midnight's Children, but also Shame, amazing book. Shame is his wonderful book, Moore's Last Sigh, amazing books. But I was less moved by him, and I don't know why. Whereas maybe Rohinton Mistry, more about post-colonial India, spoke directly to me. And so I think these are the people I would take. But in terms of cinema, also you asked me what films and stuff. And, in JNU, great thing about JNU was that there were lots of people who were interested in films. And they would know when the film festivals were coming. So you would actually get on a bus and go to Allianz or go to the German Institute and spend days on end seeing 3 films a day, 4 films a day, And so I saw all the great European art house cinema in a kind of binge watching, what you'd call binge watching today. And my favorite film, all-time favorite film, is actually by a German filmmaker, by Herzog, and it's called Aguirre, The Wrath of God. And it's a brilliant film on colonialism, but also on the kind of very inherent crime, a human crime that kind of, constitutes not just colonialism, but you could say what, settlement of human life, civilization, and the rest. It's a brilliant film. And just as I was mentioning Rushdie, it struck me that the current Indian cinema, Hindi cinema particularly, of the last 8-10 years, is a bit like what English fiction was about 40 years ago, which is that it could look at things in advance and tell us what's going on in Indian society or politics. And I've really enjoyed, say, a film like Masan, which was so ahead of its, not just ahead of its time, it so brought so forcefully a universal experience of women in India. But also of human relations again, men, women, caste, and sexuality, parents, children. I thought it was a brilliant film, so I would, but in a more serious, not serious, but I mean, I'm a great consumer of Hindi cinema on everything. I watch a lot of stuff, but a film again that struck. I haven't seen it in almost 20 years, but the film that was very profound for my becoming a historian was actually a very abstract film by Kumar Shahani. It was a film called Khayal Gatha. And that I had actually, in Chandigarh, through my sister, my brother and I, but also a bunch of our friends, we were quite serious students of Hindustani classical music. And we were taught by someone who was a direct disciple of Kumar Gandharv. And so we would actually go, I mean, I've even performed, it surprises me, as to perform and, state functions and the like. I mean, we were quite serious. But I had given up on music for very many reasons. But this film is actually not simply the history of Khayal, but really the history of India it shows. And it's a very abstract. There's very little dialogue. But it's a stunning film, and I would love to see it again, because, again, it talks about India's sort of last millennium, which has been so controversial to politics today. And, it shows the Indo-Muslim world. And yet it's not preachy. It's not either preachy, and it shows it through. And it actually made me really think that history could be creative. History's always been, it has satisfied the side of politics in me and a sense of argument, because historians really argue. Indian historians love to argue. But there was something also very creative and very human in the story that Khayal Gatha shows, through like really lavish depiction, quiet but lavish depiction. So I would sort of, I like thoughtful films, let's put it like that. Take films that stay. I don't like very messagey films, but I also like hardcore entertainment as well. I like Mirzapur, I like Patal Lok. I'll watch anything, in some ways, and certainly to do with Indian politics. So yeah, I would say I have this kind of interest, and historians, Bernard Cohen is the first one that I really read properly, and was the first book I actually bought with my own money. I think historians, my tastes change. Even my philosophers' tastes change. 10 years ago, I used to read a lot of Foucault, and now, maybe not, So things, they change. But because you asked me such a big question, I thought I should give you books and films that have stayed with me, which I will actually watch again and again.
Yeah, it's a fascinating answer. I can't wait to dive deep into this. I mean, and this is the point I often keep making is that, listen, all of us contain multitudes, and the fact that you should be able to mention Freud and Mirzapur in the same, answer kind of speaks for a lot. And you mentioned Herzog. I love Herzog. And what's interesting about Herzog is that he's one of those rare feature filmmakers who then shifted to documentary filmmaking and was a master at that as well, which is a bit rare because people kind of place those on a hierarchy in their minds, and once they are making feature films, they're just kind of happy with that. And Herzog almost moved in the other direction and did some great documentaries as well. And you mentioned Sara Soleri, of an academic of repute who also wrote memoirs. And I've had so much fun talking to you in this episode that I wish you do that also someday.
Thanks so much, Amit. Yours is really, how can I say, you're one of the best conversationalists ever, and it's a shame we haven't really met, given that we were in Chandigarh together at some point as children.
Yeah.
And I hope we will, life will give us the occasion to meet at some point.
Absolutely, inshallah. Thank you so much for your time.
Total pleasure. Thank you.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, hop on over to your nearest bookstore, online or offline, and pick up Violent Fraternity, Indian Political Thought in the Global Age. Besides writing this book, Shruti's also edited a couple of influential books, which are linked from the show notes. You can follow Shruti on Twitter at Shruti Kapila, that's one word. You can follow me at Amit Varma, AmitVarma. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.